So you're trying to make sense of reality, but reality is a very tricky and complicated thing. You encounter hundreds of different perspectives, and it's nice to be open-minded as an ideal, but the zone has been flooded with shit by bad faith actors, grifters, fools, and ideologues. So people are confused, lost in false equivalence. There's all these perspectives floating around. How do you make sense of all of them? You start to notice that not all perspectives are equal. Some are higher quality than others. How do you distinguish the higher from the lower? That's what this whole next 2 episodes are going to be about. There's a lot to say about this. Firstly, do you understand that there are such a thing as higher and lower quality perspectives? That they're not all the same? This is not obvious, and you should question this. Some people are very relativistic. Maybe you are in the absolute relativist camp and you believe, Leo, well, there's all these perspectives out there, but in the end, it's all just subjective. It's all relative. People believe whatever they want to believe. And who's to say what's right and what's wrong and what's better and what's worse? Isn't that subjective? After all, what criteria are you going to use? And aren't you going to be biased about the criteria that you're using? Yes, ultimately, that's the real epistemic conundrum here. But it turns out that if you just do a few thought experiments, you start to quickly realize that this idea that all perspectives are on the same field, on the same level, doesn't quite hold water. For example, do you really want to say that the neo-Nazi perspective is the same as the perspective of a academic or a scientist? Is that really the same level of quality there? Probably not. Do you want to say that, for example, Wahhabist Islam is at the same level of quality of worldview and perspective as, for example, the stuff that I teach through this work here with actualize.org? It would be kind of strange to put those on the same level. Intuitively, right? So you can do a few thought experiments just to kind of see where your own mind falls. But pretty quickly you'll realize that you do make distinctions. At least you operate that way. There's a lot of perspectives out there in the world that you consider to be ridiculous, crazy, insane, delusional, and so forth, right? But here's the trick, is that we don't want to just claim that something is delusional or wrong based on our own biases and prejudices. We want something more objective. We want some sort of set of criteria that we can use to evaluate quality. That would be valuable if such a thing exists and could be found. So what I'm proposing here is that we compile a list of all the lowest, most delusional, wrong, and toxic worldviews and perspectives, and then we ask the question, what are the structural similarities that they have in common? What are the psychological, epistemic, and meta features that make these low? And this is not a question of the content of a belief system or whether you personally like it or agree with it or don't agree with it. So you could say that, Nazis are distasteful. You don't like it. Generally, people don't like Nazism, don't have a high opinion of it. But that's not really the problem with Nazism. There's something deeper, structural, epistemic and structural, that's the problem with Nazism, and we want to explore what that is. And of course, we want to be very careful to do this in a way where we're not just creating a sort of an echo chamber where we are reinforcing our own preconceived assumptions and biases. We don't want to start assuming that Nazism is wrong. We want to be open-minded, right? But also, we do want to have standards. We want to have quality standards in terms of the epistemics and the psychology and the methodology and what I'm going to call the structure, not the content, right? Because the structure of Nazism, see, that's just one form of it. But then those structures, the low-quality structures of Nazism, those can be found in all sorts of other worldviews. It doesn't have to be the sort of classical German World War II style Nazi. There's a lot of ways that it manifests around the world. You got Hindu nationalism and you've got, Islamic nationalism, maybe Slavic, Russian nationalism, whatever that looks like. And so we want to look for the structures, not get hung up on the content. So what do I mean by perspective or worldview, since we're going to be using that word a lot here throughout this talk? I mean stuff like, for example, flat Earth. Flat earthers constitute a worldview or a perspective, or, as we've said, Nazism, white supremacy, various forms of ethno-nationalism. These are all different variations on the same structure. Wahhabist Islam, which stems from Saudi Arabia and is responsible for a lot of the sort of radical Islam terrorist activity. That's the philosophy underlying that. For example, 4chan. On 4chan, in the politics section and in their dating advice section, you have all sorts of philosophies about politics, toxic philosophies about dating and women. That's a perspective or a worldview. And again, I don't want to bias it with my own prejudice. So maybe 4chan is correct, right? Maybe it is. Let's be open-minded to that. But we'll figure that out by evaluating various kinds of structural criteria. How about creationism versus science? That's sort of like a dichotomy of perspectives. Usually you fall on one side or the other. How do you tell which one is higher and which one is lower? It might not be obvious. And you might know in your heart that science is better than creationism, but like, can you articulate why? Or fundamentalism versus atheism. Which one of those is the higher? Which one is the lower? Or if that seems too easy and obvious for you, how about science versus postmodernism? How do you tell which one of those is higher or lower? How about liberal versus conservative, left versus right? Is there a higher and a lower amongst those, or are they even? How do we determine that in a more objective way than just our own personal political biases? How about the woke versus anti-woke perspective and worldview? How about the manosphere, red pill, black pill, incel, pickup worldviews? How about Zionism? How about various kinds of conspiracy theories that are out there? How do we gauge the quality of those? How about feminism, neoliberalism? How about capitalism versus Marxism? How about various New Age worldviews and perspectives? How about the views and perspectives of certain public intellectuals and influencers, maybe Jordan Peterson or Elon Musk? You hear a lot of their perspectives. How do you determine if this is a quality perspective that you should be taking seriously or that you should be dismissing? How about integral theory from Ken Wilber? What's the quality of that? So these are just some examples so that we're on the same page as to what we're talking about. Another way to look at this is like this. Consider Fox News. Fox News presents a certain worldview and a certain perspective. So the question is, what's wrong with Fox News? And I don't mean that in a shallow way. I mean that in a deep way. I don't mean the content. What's wrong with the content of Fox News or the fact that it's a conservative perspective? That's not the problem. I mean, what is wrong epistemologically? What is wrong cognitively? What is wrong ethically and morally? And what is wrong developmentally? Now you might say, well, Leo, nothing is wrong with Fox News. I agree with a lot of their opinions, you might say. But there is something wrong. Because just a year or two ago, Fox News settled a defamation lawsuit for $780 million. That's not a little thing. $1 billion lawsuit over defamation and misinformation. That's just one example. There's more. They face other kinds of lawsuits, and that's just the tip of the iceberg of what's wrong with Fox News. So now you might say, well, Leo, the lawsuit was all bullshit. I mean, again, here, you see the problem here is that even to broach this issue of figuring out criteria for higher and lower worldviews, already, as you're coming into this topic, you have a set of biases. You're subscribed to some kind of worldview and perspective, and that's going to color and distort even how you receive some of this information. Now, I'm just bringing up Fox News just as an obvious example. hopefully you see that this isn't about me taking personal objections to certain opinions that Fox News has. There's a deeper structural rot within the entire enterprise of Fox News. And it's not that they're conservative, because there are high-quality conservative political perspectives and commentators and analysis, but Fox News is not that. It's low quality. It's really low quality. But how do you articulate what that is, why it is that way, what makes it that way? So here we go. Here's a list of criteria for distinguishing lower and higher perspectives. We're going to start by mentioning all the lower ones first, and then we'll go to the higher ones. These are very deep lists. I spent months brainstorming, thinking deeply about these lists, running various thought experiments in my mind, even running these ideas through AIs multiple times. This is deep stuff. So here we go. And again, I'm going to give you my conclusions and my answers, but what I want here for you is not to just take this in as a given, but to really question and think through this stuff and really make these lists your own. Add to it, remove parts that don't make sense or that you haven't validated. This is something you need to actually work through in your mind for these lists to be powerful and to have the impact that we want. Okay, so first point is just lower perspectives are distinguished by a basic lack of education, reading, and facts. There's just a lack of fact, under-education, poor education. Such a person with a lower perspective cannot even, for example, point to a map, point to a country on a map. For example, I'm willing to bet that if you take like Donald Trump and you ask him to find Nigeria on a map, he won't be able to do it. Now, that might seem like a trivial sort of nitpicky thing, like, oh, well, he doesn't know Nigeria, so what does it matter? But it does matter. If you're going to be a leader of, of the world and of a big country that has dealings with all these other countries, you should not just be able to point out where the countries are on a map, but you should know about their geography, their background, their history, their geopolitical situation, their military situation. Like, all these things are important to know, which is why it's important that when you elect politicians and leaders that they actually have a factual historical understanding of things, which is another aspect of this point of lack of basic education. Is just a lot of people are ignorant of basic history. Just ignorance of basic history. They don't know it. Or their history is very one-sided. For example, just American history, not world history, not European history, never mind Asian history, African history. It's like, for many people, for many Americans, even American history, they don't know very well. They don't know it accurately. They don't know the realities of slavery. They don't know the realities of certain conflicts and so on. They might not even have ever read the Constitution. And yet they have very strong political opinions, but completely ignorant of even what the amendments in the Constitution are. Stuff like that. Or ignorant of basic science. There's a lot of people with a lack of scientific knowledge, just like the basic stuff, basic biology, basic chemistry, basic physics, even basic mathematics. And then these people go and they try to make sense of the world. So imagine somebody who doesn't have a good understanding of history, then goes into politics. That's going to create some low-quality worldviews. Or imagine such a person goes into various sorts of theories about the universe, like maybe flat Earth theory. But then a lot of these flat earthers, you can tell that their perspectives are low because you can ask them basic science questions they don't have answers to. And I don't mean stuff that pertains to necessarily the question of the shape of the earth, but I mean just basic. They might not know basic math. They might not know just like basic geology, which you should know in order to start to understand how we could know the shape of the earth. So just don't underestimate how many people in the world are severely undereducated. And even those who supposedly seem educated because maybe they went to school, they finished high school, and they even went to university, but that's not a guarantee that they're well educated on some topic. You could finish university and you could still be ignorant about history and basic science. That's very, very common. So if you don't have that just basic foundation of education, you're going to make all sorts of epistemic mistakes in your understanding of reality. Because look, in the end, what your mind is trying to do is to make sense of reality. Education helps you to do that because the education system, even though it has its corruption and it has its flaws, and of course, but still, there's just like basic quality standards that are set within academia. For example, if you make it to university, you will be inculcated into these quality standards. There's going to be standards for how to write a research paper, how to cite your sources, just even the fact that you need to look for sources and how to distinguish, for example, between low quality and high quality sources. When I went to university, they taught us that. If I didn't go to university, I wouldn't know these things. And the majority of mankind did not go to university, doesn't know these things, hasn't been educated and trained in these sort of like basic fundamentals of knowledge acquisition. Because there's a lot of bad information, bad knowledge out there. How do you distinguish them between the good and the bad? Well, part of the answer is that you go to university and they teach you a set of standards. They hold you to those standards. They test you on those standards. And if you don't pass a test, you don't get a degree. You don't pass your classes. You don't go on to even higher education beyond that. The next point of lower perspectives is lower perspectives are misinformed. They get information from low quality sources and they just have the facts wrong. Just the facts wrong. And you need the basic facts in order to then go on to make better sense of the world. If you got your basic facts wrong, if you don't understand evolution, you don't understand basic science and math and history, well, how good is your sense-making going to be? The next distinguishing criteria of lower perspectives is a lack of experience. People who hold lower perspectives just lack experience in the domain about which they hold opinions or beliefs. They don't have the direct experience. They haven't actually done the thing. They haven't been to the place. And yet they have opinions, they have beliefs about it. For example, you might have beliefs about the shape of the earth, or you might have beliefs about evolution, but you've never actually done any like field research in geology. You haven't actually gone out and looked at rocks, climbed them, studied them. So geology influences your thinking about evolution, influences your thinking about the earth ultimately. And then you haven't had the experience of, this applies in so many ways, right? To so many different domains. You need to have experience with a domain to be able to have good opinions about it. And even very intelligent people, so-called experts and intellectuals, they can fall into the trap of starting to speak outside their domain of expertise. You might have a psychologist who's really experienced in psychology, but then he's going to be rendering his opinions about politics and about religion and about science and about climate change and about evolution, but he's a psychologist. See, these are very different things. So lack of experience, this is where a lot of mistakes happen. Because to say anything intelligent about reality, any domain of reality, you need to be experienced in that particular thing. And a lot of what we have today, especially in the sort of social media ecosystem, is we have a lot of people who have made a profession out of talking about everything and anything because they need endless content. Every day they need to release a new video or a new podcast or something. They need to keep their mouth yapping about something. And it's hard to have experience about everything, but they get paid a lot of money to have opinions about everything. So they talk about everything, even though they have no experience with Do you have experience with climate science? No. Do you have experience with evolution? Study of evolution, of how fossils and stuff work? No. Do you have experience with astronomy, looking at the stars and calculating distances and stuff? No, right? So then why are you opining on these things? That's the issue. A really critical point of distinction between the lower and higher perspectives is that the lower ones are always based on belief and ideology, because that's so much easier than the alternative. Belief and ideology is how you tell a lower perspective. And a lot of people, they don't have enough epistemic awareness to even understand that they're holding a belief or an ideology. And they think that any worldview just is a belief and an ideology and there's no other alternative. But that's not the case. And so the lower perspectives are distinguished by a preoccupation with defending a belief system. Might be a Christian perspective, a Muslim perspective, might even be scientific beliefs. Science is also based on beliefs. It might be a political set of beliefs that you have, whether you're sort of a free market, laissez-faire capitalist, or a libertarian, or a Marxist. These are belief systems. This is ideology. And so once your mind is filled with these beliefs and ideologies, then the dynamic is that the mind gets attached to them. These turn into mental attachments, and then the mind is always in a sort of a mode where it needs to defend these beliefs against the onslaught of contradictory evidence and reality itself, which is like water seeping in through the cracks of your mind. And then you're constantly battling this. And when you find yourself in that state, that is what lower perspectives are. And so what you see amongst a lot of these lower perspectives is that the holders of these perspectives, they're just in a constant battle against reality. And they are constantly working double time, backpedaling or doing mental gymnastics to try to justify, rationalize, and defend some belief systems they were programmed with early in life, and that they're attached to, that their survival is hitched to, and now they need to be defending it. And so this presents a very serious conflict of interest, because once you have this belief system that you need to defend, you're attached to it, you can't really do a genuine inquiry into the nature of reality, because you need it to be some particular way. And what's going to happen as you do a lot of sense making is that you'll realize that the way you thought reality was, that it just isn't anything like that. And that's going to be very painful for you the more attachments you have to various belief systems. So the lower perspectives do not do genuine inquiry, and they don't understand its importance. In a lot of, for example, Christian religion and Jewish religion, Islamic religion, the very notion of asking questions and doing a genuine inquiry into the nature of reality or God or your own religion is anathema. It's taboo. It's discouraged. This shuts off genuine exploration, genuine development of the mind, because they just want you to believe what you were told. And questioning it is like blasphemy, heresy. So the lower perspective doesn't know the difference between belief and insight. That's the key distinction, belief and insight. I have an episode called What is Insight, which explains that difference a bit more, in more depth. But that's a key distinction. There's a very big difference between a belief in the shape of the earth versus having an insight into the shape of the earth. Or a belief in God and having an insight into what God is, or why it does or doesn't exist. Huge difference. Huge difference. So the higher quality perspectives are going to be based on insight, and the lower ones are going to be based on belief. And the difference is that insight is not man-made, whereas belief is. You can make up a belief right now about anything. You can believe anything. But having an insight is not something you can just bullshit yourself around. You need to actually have a particular insight. That's not even something you're consciously in control of. An insight hits you. It comes to you. You don't even know when it's going to come. It may never come. So that's a big difference. It's much harder to have insight than it is to invent and to hold beliefs. Lower perspectives start with conclusions and seek confirmation of those conclusions. So they kind of reason backwards from their conclusions or what they need to be true. I need for there to be a God, and then I'm going to rationalize and look for evidence of why God exists. Or I need for Islam to be true, and therefore my mind is going to look for explanations of why Islam must be true or must be the best religion, and so on. That's not genuine inquiry into the nature of reality. A genuine inquiry starts from a place of not knowing what's true, not even caring really what's true, not having any attachments or biases, and just being open to a genuine exploration, and then just see what will come to you. See what experience, what insight will come to you as you're exploring. And don't try to confirm what you want. So the lower perspectives always make this mistake, is that they're so fixated on what they want reality to be, what they need it to be, emotionally, what they need out of it, what would serve and benefit their survival. And then, of course, they sort of just assume that's what it has to be, and then they go through a process of confirming that. And if you do that, you will confirm it. If you need something badly enough, your mind will invent ways to confirm that it's true. That's your mind is very powerful in that regard. Can convince you of anything. If you haven't noticed, if you look throughout history, humankind has believed all sorts of ridiculous things, which shows you how easy it is to convince yourself of anything. Your mind can convince you of anything, as long as you need it to be so badly enough. Okay, here's the next criteria point, which is probably one of the biggest on this list. So a lower perspective is distinguished by bad or no epistemology at all, no awareness of epistemology. It's not enough to know a thing. You have to know how you know it, why you know that it's true. So this is a sort of a meta step, a meta awareness. Are you, or is your worldview meta aware of the epistemics of how worldviews and belief systems work, how they propagate, where they come from, how justification works, how reason works, the pitfalls of reason, the pitfalls of beliefs, the difference between a belief and an insight. Scientific method or other kinds of epistemic methods that are out there, their pros, cons, their limitations and trade-offs, right? This is all epistemology. And that's a lot of what I spend my time teaching you and talking about, is because it's so fundamental. Without a deep grasp of epistemology and the problems within epistemology that apply to any kind of sense-making that you want to do, whether it's religion, politics, health and nutrition, medicine, healthcare, business, science, philosophy, spirituality, all of this requires sense-making, sometimes very deep sense-making. And so before you can say that you know something about the world, really you have to take a step back and you have to say, well, how do we know anything at all? How is knowledge even possible? What are the pitfalls of knowledge? And there's a deep field that you can study philosophically called epistemology, which points out how difficult it is to acquire knowledge of even the most fundamental and simple basic things, like how do you know that even arithmetic is is valid? How do you know mathematics is valid? Based on what is mathematics true? Is mathematics just a human invention? Is it a belief system? Is it something more than that? Is mathematics something that's true just for the human mind, or is it true more generally, more universally? How do we know that? See, usually in school, and really even in university, the education doesn't go that deep. It teaches you facts and methods, but it doesn't teach you how to derive the facts and the methods. So you're taught Newton's 3 laws, but you're not really taught how to derive them. You're taught geometry, but you might not be taught how to derive certain truths within geometry or truths within mathematics. You might be taught the scientific method, but you're not taught to question the method or how to develop the method or what the limits of the method might be. Because in a sense, that takes you off track. That's a big tangent from like, let's just get to work on doing stuff, right? Like, if you're learning science, chances are you're learning science not because you want to understand the deep foundations of science. It's just because you want to get into the laboratory and start doing science and start finding stuff, start finding results, start developing, interesting technology using your findings, publishing research papers and getting grants and getting research and awards for your research, getting published in magazines and so forth, getting patted on the back for your good work. So it's a tangent to say, wait a minute, let's pause for 10 years and research the foundations of science. That's a tangent for most people. And so it is with other fields, not just science, but with all fields, right? People just want like quick results. They don't want to waste 10 years in philosophical, thought experiments and so on. So lower perspectives take knowledge for granted. They're not even aware that epistemic problems exist. They don't care about them either. They just want the result. It's like, I just want to believe in God. I don't care about what method is going to be used to question and inquire about the nature of God, whether God exists or doesn't exist. I don't want to go through all that. I just want to believe in God and get the benefits, right? I just want to pray to God and get my benefits. I want to feel happier. I want to feel spiritually connected. I want to have mystical experiences, stuff like that. Or I don't want to go to hell. See, religion's very tricky because religion is so sneaky as an epistemic system because it doesn't even let you question it, because as soon as you start to question it, somebody will come along and say, well, if you question God too much, you're going to hell. See, that's how they get you right there. So one of the criteria of lower perspectives is that lower perspectives, they don't want you to do a genuine inquiry. And why is that? Because there's a danger there and a threat from genuine inquiry. So a lower perspective will have mechanisms built into it that prevent you from questioning it or reflecting self-reflection. A perspective will prevent self-reflection from actually happening. And that's how you know that it's a low perspective. Because if a perspective was deeply truthful, it wouldn't mind self-reflection because it would be secure in knowing that if you question all of Christianity, eventually you should realize that it's all true. So then go ahead, question it. Question hell and question God and question what method by which you know that God exists. Question everything. But see, that's not how Christianity behaves. They have all sorts of punishments and they use fear, emotional manipulation techniques to get you. So when a perspective or a worldview uses emotional manipulation techniques, that's one way that you know that it's not a very high perspective. Because you got to wonder, why? Why is this worldview trying to emotionally manipulate me? If it was true, why would it care? Well, as it turns out, it's not an accident that this emotional manipulation is happening. It needs to happen, because if it didn't happen, nobody would buy into these systems. Now look, sometimes here I'm speaking about these worldviews or perspectives as though they are a person or an individual that holds them, that you're dealing with. And sometimes I'm speaking about the system or worldview in the more abstract sense, right? So we can speak of a Christian who you're having a debate with. That's a Christian, let's say, who's a fundamentalist and has a low quality epistemology. Hasn't even thought about why he's a Christian. He's just a Christian. He was just like raised that way. Doesn't even question it. So that's an individual. And then you have Christianity as a system, that spreads around the whole world as sort of a mimetic system. And then that system itself has these lower quality aspects to it, right? So when we're talking about these aspects and this criteria, it can apply to a system in the abstract, or it can apply to an individual. For example, you can find an individual who doesn't care about doing inquiry or epistemology. You come to him and you talk about, hey, let's talk about epistemology, and they just don't care. It's obvious to you that they don't even care. They're not even interested in that. That immediately tells you the rough level of quality of the kind of worldview this person can have. Because there's no way that you can have a high quality worldview if you don't even care about epistemology and that stuff that's like, oh, it's your eyes glaze over and roll in the back of your head because you're so bored by epistemology. You want to do something fun. Well, that kind of person can never have a great understanding of reality because it's just not possible with that kind of attitude. So your attitude matters very much. So you can gauge the quality of perspectives, of people. For example, maybe you're dealing with some influencer, maybe you're listening to some podcast, and some podcaster is giving you his opinions or perspective, his worldview. Well, how do you determine whether you should listen to this podcaster or not? Well, one of the ways is you can assess what is his attitude towards epistemology. Does he talk about it? Does he care about these kinds of meta issues? Or is he completely oblivious to it, right? Like if you watch Fox News, if you watch some political commentator on Fox News, are they ever talking about epistemology? Are they ever talking about going meta? Are they ever talking about philosophical inquiry? Are they ever talking about questioning the foundations of their own belief systems? Never, right? Never, never. So that tells you something. And if you bring up this kind of topic to them, how are they going to react? That's a really good test. What would happen if you went on Fox News and you start to talk about some of these criteria with one of these Fox News hosts? What would happen? Would they shut you down? Probably. That's most likely what would happen. They just cut your mic. How would they debate you? Would they get angry? Would they get defensive? Would they start a lot of drama, emotional drama? Would they start yelling at you? Calling you names? See? These are all little clues to where their ego mind is at. Because you're not just dealing with this sense-making in a way where it's like, it's just pure facts and pure logic. No. It's like your ego is wrapped up with all this. So ego is a big factor. So people who have no or a bad epistemology, they are lost in content and they don't have any awareness of the structure of how the mind works and comes to understand reality. The next criteria is that low perspectives are closed-minded. They're stubborn like an old mule. If you run into a person like that or a belief system like that, that's a huge clue because there's no way you're going to understand reality with that kind of attitude. Another criteria is that low perspectives simply don't care about the truth. There's zero interest in the truth. Doesn't take the truth seriously. But there's a little extra twist, a little wrinkle here, which is very sneaky, is that even though these people or these perspectives don't care about the truth at all, they don't announce that to you. In fact, what they do is they posture and they do the opposite, which is that they put on, they sort of puff themselves up and they put on a cloak. They love to cloak themselves in the truth. So very ironically, the people who care about the truth the least will make a big act of actually caring about the truth. And they will say that they have the truth. The truth is on their side, right? So like if you talk to a fundamentalist Christian, they when you speak to them and you say, hey, you don't care about the truth, really, do you? They'll say, no, the truth is the most important thing to me. So you can't trust their words. But what you can do to determine how much does truth matter to somebody is, are they willing to go through the epistemic process and steps? Like, are they really willing to evaluate and question their own beliefs? If they're not, then they're not really interested in the truth. It's just posturing. Of course, almost by definition, anything anybody believes, any worldview anyone holds, they're going to hold that as the truth. And it's going to feel true to them. So you can't just believe them and how passionate they are. And in fact, they're going to be compensating. The more doubts they have about their worldview, the more they're going to try to posture and act as though they're passionate about the truth. But really, you can tell by talking to them and questioning them that they're not serious about doing inquiry. Instead, what they're interested in is they're interested in defending a belief system, which they believe is true. But that's very different from a genuine seeking of the truth. Because with a genuine seeking of the truth, there's an open-mindedness that is necessary there. And there's also evidence that one has been doing the work, the epistemic work. Like, you can ask a Christian, what's the epistemic work that you did to become a Christian, right? And for most of them, what'll happen is that they'll just look at you like a deer in the headlights. They won't even know what you're talking about because they haven't done any of the work, because it's just a belief system. They're just hoping that it's true. I would have a lot more respect for those Christians if they could actually outline the epistemic process through which they came to believe what they believe. But they can't do that because they didn't get to Christianity that way, right? See, nobody gets to Christianity through a process of deep, genuine, truth-seeking inquiry. It doesn't happen that way because you're just taught it at birth. You're indoctrinated into it. And then later, you can posture as though you went through some sort of process to get there, but in truth, you did not go through a process. It was just indoctrination. There are a lot of very intelligent Christians who can make very good arguments for God and against atheism and against evolution and for creationism and so forth. They can make very good arguments, very academic sounding arguments, but even they themselves don't recognize how they got to believe what they believe. They have fooled themselves into thinking that they got to Christianity through some sort of logical, rational process. That is not how they got there. That's all backwards rationalization. And to be able to have enough self-awareness and honesty to admit that to yourself, that is what distinguishes higher from lower perspectives. The ability to do that, which most people don't have. They don't have that much self-awareness or self-honesty because it's difficult to do that. The next criteria is that lower perspectives have some other agenda besides truth or pure understanding. There's something else that they're after. They want salvation, they want happiness, they want security for their family, they want a job, they want money, they want fame, they want sex, they want status. They want to be a preacher. They want to be looked up to in their community. They want to defend their community, something like that, which is different than truth and pure understanding. Another criteria of lower perspectives is that they have low intellectual curiosity. Just there's not a care for learning, and if there is learning, it's motivated by an agenda. I'm learning arguments against my enemies and my opponents so that I can defeat them in a debate. That's not genuine learning. That's not genuine inquiry. See? So this is also a very tricky one because a lot of people are into learning. A lot of people who hold diluted worldviews are into learning. You know, if you talk to a Nazi, a neo-Nazi, or a flat earther, they will posture as though they're really into learning. Yeah, I'm learning so much about the flat earth, and that's why I believe the earth is flat. Or, yeah, Leo, I'm reading so many books about the nature of race, the science behind race, and that really, there's so much to this racism stuff and to the ethnocentrism stuff of white supremacy. There's so much There's so much science behind it. There's so much reason, logic, and there's so much history behind it. I've been reading all these history books that justify and make sense of this neo-Nazi perspective. But there's something deeper going on there. That's a motivated kind of learning you're doing. You're doing that learning because you had some kind of agenda that you started off with. And then now you want to keep reinforcing that agenda and building upon it, and see, you're not doing genuine learning. And in this way, your mind is actually cherry picking sources and books and historical facts and figures and little bits of science here and there. You're picking and choosing to justify some preconceived agenda that you had. And that's what makes your perspective low, because you're not considering the alternatives. You're not trying to falsify your perspective. Lower perspectives also have a lack of intellectual integrity. For a lower perspective, truth is defined as anything that serves some emotional need or survival need that the perspective or the individual has. For example, when a neo-Nazi is learning, reading books and so forth, they're not doing a genuine inquiry, because really this whole neo-Nazi project is coming from a deep emotional lack or need, a survival need that this ideology is serving. For example, the need for making sense and dealing with the immigration that is happening around you, or the cultural diversity that is arising around you, and you don't like it, you don't feel comfortable. You don't feel comfortable with who your neighbors are. They're a different race. You don't feel comfortable with the language. The people around you are foreign languages that are being spoken around you. You don't feel comfortable about maybe homeless people living near you, whatever that is. You don't feel comfortable about the power that women have more power in the hierarchy these days than they did in the past. And you're not happy with with how much sex you're getting. You're not happy with how women are treating you. You're not happy that they're rejecting you. And then this now leads to emotions of bitterness, anger, sadness, frustration. And then now you need some way to make sense of it. Your mind needs some way to make sense of it and to figure out, what are we going to do about this individually and collectively? Politically, what are we going to do? And also individually, what am I going to do? And so now from this point of view, you can build up an ideology. But really what's going on is that ideology is serving some sort of personal needs that you have. It's not about the truth. So a lot of people and lower perspectives, they conflate the truth with personal needs, personal survival needs, as if those are the same thing, which they're not. Another criteria of the lower perspectives is a lack of responsibility. There's just a fundamental avoidance of responsibility and intellectual responsibility. So taking responsibility in life in general is difficult and requires maturity. That's one of the hallmarks of maturity, is how much responsibility you're willing to take in life. But there's this other aspect of responsibility, which I'm going to call intellectual responsibility, which means how much responsibility do you take for the integrity of your own mind and intellect, to train it, to educate it, to look for contradictions within your own worldview. For example, if you were a Christian and you had intellectual integrity and you took intellectual responsibility, then you would owe it to yourself to question your Christianity. Where did it come from? Why do you believe it? How do you know that it's true? What if it's not true? So taking intellectual responsibility is skepticism, genuine inquiry, being open-minded, opening your mind to the possibility, hey, maybe Christianity is just one religion out of many. How do I know that that's the true one? And then if you took intellectual responsibility, you would have to say to yourself, well, if I'm honest with myself, I learned Christianity when I was very, very young, too young to really consent, too young to be able to question it. Before I even had reasoning abilities, I was taught Christianity. Therefore, I have to assume that maybe I was just programmed with it, indoctrinated into it. Therefore, I need to go through a epistemic process. Maybe Christianity is true, but I need to go through an epistemic process to verify that. So I should go study some Islam, study some Buddhism, study some atheism, study some existentialism and nihilism and postmodernism, and compare fairly and evenly, objectively compare all these different worldviews, read some books, listen to some experts, do some debates, so forth. And then if Christianity turns out to be the best worldview, then okay, good, fine. Then I'll keep it. And if it's not, then I'll set it aside and I'll go with something else. See, this would be taking an intellectual responsibility. Now, how many Christians actually do that? Less than 1 in 100. And look, I don't mean to pick on Christians here. This can apply to Muslims, can apply to Buddhists, can apply to atheists, whatever. The fact that we're talking about Christians is irrelevant, right? We're talking about structural stuff, not content. Christianity is just content. There's a deeper structure there, which is very similar. Christianity has a very similar structure to every religion, such as Islam, Judaism, and whatever else I'm forgetting. The next criteria is lower perspectives are resistant to new information. They tend to reject it, deny it, and use various kinds of mechanisms. They tend to ignore, dismiss, dodge, and rationalize away contradictory evidence. For example, if you're a creationist, you believe the earth is 5,000 years old, how do you explain the existence of dinosaurs, fossils? I had a friend in high school. We were sitting, I remember very vividly, like it was yesterday. We were sitting in AP biology class, and he was one of these kind of Christians, and I didn't even know. We were just talking, and just somehow randomly, I found out from him that he believes the earth is 5,000 years old. I'm like, what are you kidding me? At that time, I thought he was joking because it was so laughable to me. Here we are sitting in a biology class, studying advanced biology. But he was serious about it. I'm like, well, what about dinosaur bones? How do you explain that? A dinosaur bone is like 100 million years old. And he's like, well, that's easy. He said, God placed those bones, these fake bones, these are fake bones placed in the earth by God in order to trick mankind into, testing mankind's faith, to see if mankind really has the faith. And those people who believe the bones are real, those people, they're the ones who lack the faith. And those people who know that the bones are fake and that the earth is actually 5,000 years old, those people are the true Christians, and they're going to heaven, and the rest of you are going to hell. That's literally what he told me. It blew my fucking mind that somebody could believe this. So that's what I mean by a low quality perspective. Now, why is that perspective low quality? Well, you can see how much like mental gymnastics one has to go through to invent a scheme like that. Now look, if you really take a step back and you want to be truly neutral and objective here, and you want to do like quality epistemology here, then you gotta take his perspective seriously. At least one time in your life, you gotta take it seriously. Is it possible that God put fake fossils into the earth to test mankind's, commitment to God and to the Christian faith? It sounds pretty far-fetched and outlandish, but hey, maybe that's possible. We can't rule it out because we don't know, right? When we're beginning our inquiry, we don't know. So we have to be open-minded to it, because if we weren't open-minded, then we would have a low perspective. A high perspective means we're pretty open-minded. But then you have to go through a process to really, question that and to see how plausible is it. And then if you really believe that has so many other consequences, right? It has so many epistemic consequences. Like if God could fake the dinosaur bones, what else did God fake? You'd have to kind of like wonder. And then you have to kind of go through and see what other things did God fake? Because that would have enormous consequences, right? So it is good to take such a thing seriously. But if you're taking it seriously, like you got to go all the way. You can't just throw that out there as a one-off, kind of like, oh, well, yeah, God could have faked the bones. And then you can just kind of like go about your day, go about your biology normally. It's like, no, wait a minute. If this was actually true, if you really believe that, like this has such massive epistemic consequences that you have to like rethink your entire understanding of reality if this is true. But you can see that friend that I was talking to, he wasn't doing that work. This was just a rationalization, just an excuse, a dodge. And so you can, if you're doing this work seriously, you can see that within yourself. Are you dodging? Are you doing mental gymnastics and rationalizations? Or are you doing genuine inquiry and taking the epistemology stuff seriously? Another criteria of lower perspective is that they have an inability to admit mistakes. Because if you admit one mistake within fundamentalist Christianity, well, the whole thing starts to unravel, or at least that's how the mind can feel. So there's a sort of a tendency of not wanting to admit mistakes because you need your worldview to be perfect. And of course, that then makes you very defensive because any one little mistake could be the end of your worldview. And so there's a sort of a fragility here. Lower perspectives are fragile in this way. Another criteria of lower perspectives is an inability to change one's view in light of new evidence. That's the closed-mindedness. An incapability of seriously considering different points of view. Just a lack of even desire to consider a different point of view. You can tell this in a lot of political pundits and commentators who are partisans. If somebody is a very staunch conservative or a staunch progressive or leftist, they just don't want to consider, they can't, their mind literally cannot consider the alternative. A hardcore conservative just cannot consider that a Marxist could be, Marxism could be the true or better, higher perspective. And vice versa, a Marxist, somebody who's a staunch Marxist just cannot believe that capitalism could be a better worldview than Marxism because they're stuck on that ideology. So yeah, this is a huge distinguishing characteristic, is that lower perspectives, they're stuck on a single perspective and they can't jump out of it and then back into it. They just don't have that mental flexibility. They're literally incapable of doing it with their mind, whereas higher perspectives are. Lower perspectives are unable to see partial truth in every perspective. For example, a lower perspective cannot see the partial truth within Nazism, or within flat Earth, or within libertarianism, or within Marxism, or within capitalism. The ability to see this partial truth, that only comes from a higher developed mind. Lower perspectives are characteristically overconfident in their knowledge and in their beliefs, and they overcompensate, and then they act that out emotionally. Lower perspectives come from low cognitive development and rationality. A lot of human beings on this planet haven't even reached the rational stage of cognitive development. They're at the pre-rational. And then beyond the rational, there's the post-rational. And then beyond that, there's even something else. But they haven't even reached rationality. They don't know how to be rational. Usually to reach the rational stage, you have to go to school, not just school, but you have to go to university. That's really where you learn rationality. And many people don't go to university, so they never learn it. They don't really teach it to you in high school very well. Lower perspectives make many groundless assumptions. They're built on assumptions and they don't question their assumptions. Lower perspectives are prone to magical thinking, superstition, and being faith-based. Just being based on intuition. And this is where intuition can really get you into trouble, because a lot of pre-rational people, they will convince themselves that they're more than rational because they're so intuitive. And then this intuition, though, then is never checked against reality. It's never actually tested. So one of the characteristics of low-quality perspectives is that they don't actually test themselves. They're resistant to falsification. They either are designed in such a way that they can't be disproven because they're just tautological, they're just held as true, and then rationalized backwards, or all sorts of cherry-picking of data and evidence happens to validate Or all sorts of kind of like dodging mechanisms are used to avoid falsification. And there's no interest and there's no responsibility taken to falsify one's own perspective. So this is where intellectual responsibility comes in, right? No matter what perspective you hold, whether flat Earth or round Earth or integral theory, spiral dynamics, if that's your worldview, it's your responsibility to try to falsify it. Not to confirm it, but to falsify it. That means you go out of your way to look for disconfirming evidence. You ask yourself questions like, how could spiral dynamics be false? How could materialist science be false? And then you go to work on that. And you can tell that people who are not interested in going to work on the falsification, you can tell that those are the low people, low perspective people. And you can tell that they will never have a deep understanding of reality. It's not possible. You have to be able to do this if you want accurate sense-making. Because your mind will come up with all sorts of bad intuitions and bad ideas and bad beliefs. You're going to have to sort through that by a long, arduous process. So the lower perspectives are prone to fantasy. They come up with a fantasy of how reality works, and then they build and build on that fantasy, and they invest themselves emotionally into that fantasy. And these fantasies, even though I say fantasy, you might think of something fantastical, like believing in unicorns. That's a fantasy. But remember, fantasies can be much more mundane. For example, I consider libertarianism to be a fantasy. I consider Marxism to be a fantasy. I consider many capitalists have a fantasy of capitalism. How is capitalism a fantasy? Well, you construct in your mind a picture of what capitalism is, how good it is, ignoring all of its faults and problems. And then you build and build and you reinforce that fantasy with evidence from stock market. You're cherry picking stuff from the stock market, from the Wall Street Journal, from certain philosophers, capitalist philosophers and libertarian philosophers that you read, maybe Milton Friedman and whoever else, you're cherry picking stuff. You're reading books, but as you're reading books, all of this is contributing to building a fantasy in your mind of what capitalism is. And then you believe that this is really how our economy works, is this fantasy. You confuse the fantasy in your mind of the economy with the actual economy. So fantasy is a much more serious thing than believing in flying spaghetti monsters and unicorns. Lower perspectives reject empirical evidence. They are often not even interested in empirical evidence. They tend to also be absolutistic. When they believe something, they absolutely believe it with 100% certainty. It can't be wrong. God must exist. Or for an atheist, God cannot exist. Now, there's different versions of atheism. I'm not saying all atheists believe that. The higher quality atheists, they will actually acknowledge that, you know what, I'm an atheist. I don't think God exists, but I can't rule it out entirely because, you can't really prove a negative. But see, even when somebody says that, already you can tell that's a little bit of a higher perspective. Because if someone was just an absolute atheist, that would be a lower perspective than someone who's a little bit more open. Because the reality is that you can't prove a negative. You can't absolutely know that God does not exist. So you should always leave a little bit of room, and you don't want to be absolutistic about it. So there's different qualities, even within a worldview. Also note, this is an important point, there can be different qualities, right? Not everybody is the same. So just because we're talking about Christianity, there's different qualities of Christian. The lowest qualities of Christian are the ones that are the most absolutistic, the ones who are the most dogmatic, the ones who believe the earth is 5,000 years old, the ones who believe that God put fake fossils and dinosaurs into the ground to trick us. Then you have higher quality Christians. The higher quality ones are a little bit more open. They show you that they're not fully certain. They are willing to admit that there's certain mistakes within Christianity. They're willing to admit that there's contradictions within the Bible. They're willing to admit that maybe the Bible is not written by God. It was written by man, which means there could be flaws and errors in it, right? See, they're more open in this respect. And with these kinds of Christians, you can have more interesting debates and discussions. And maybe some of them are even open-minded enough to be talked out of their faith. Not very likely, but the highest quality Christian would be willing to be talked out of his faith. The lowest quality ones are stuck in it forever, absolutistically. So this sort of absolutism comes from an incapacity to handle not knowing. That's really what it is. Lower perspectives are incapable of admitting not knowing. I have a whole episode about the power and importance of this concept of not knowing. Go watch that. There's a lot to say about not knowing. It's such a powerful notion. But see, the mind is uncomfortable not knowing. The mind would rather fill in the gap with some kind of false knowledge or a fantasy rather than just remain open and empty. And so lower quality minds, they just can't handle that, and they just need something to latch onto, something to cling to, right? So like, the solution to many of these lower quality perspectives, like fundamentalist Christianity, fundamentalist Islam, flat earth, and so on, is just, the solution is so simple, is just to realize, like, do some self-reflection and then ask yourself, do I really know that the earth is flat? And you'll immediately realize that I don't know. I don't know if the earth is flat. And that's huge. That's a huge insight, right? That's an insight. It's an insight to know that you don't know something. It's an insight to realize that me thinking that the earth is flat, that's a belief. And of course, me thinking the earth is round, that's also a belief. It's an insight to realize that about the workings of your mind. And that is a much superior, higher quality position than to either believe the earth is flat or just round or whatever. It's better not to know, because the truth is that most people don't know the shape of the earth. That's the truth. But see, that's a difficult truth to admit, because, most scientists are in a position that they don't know the shape of the earth. It's a belief that they hold. But for them to admit that opens such a big gap in their epistemology that it's too dangerous. So they have to invent ways of convincing themselves and others that, no, Leo, I really do know. It's not just a belief. It's not the same thing as flat earth, and blah, 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 blah. And they can draw you diagrams and go through calculations to show you that the earth is actually round, and that they know why, and that it's not a belief that it's round, but it's actually round, and that they know it. But you don't know it. You're just not willing to admit that to yourself, and you haven't reflected deeply enough into the epistemology of this situation. And so just, for example, from talking to a scientist, I could take a scientist from MIT with a Nobel Prize, and we could sit down and just have this conversation about the shape of the earth and how he knows that the earth is round. We can have this discussion, and just by having this discussion, I can already tell his level of low versus high sense-making and worldview, and just in general, because I'll be able to understand his epistemology. I'll be able to tell that he doesn't understand the difference between a belief and an insight. I can tell that he doesn't understand the importance of not knowing and what not knowing really is. Stuff like that. And so the whole point of this conversation that we're having is that I want to develop that capacity in you. It's taken me like 10 years of doing this work nonstop to to develop such a fluency in epistemology and how the mind plays all of its tricks that I can listen to somebody for just 30 seconds or a few minutes, and I can tell whether it's a scientist, a religious person, a philosophy person, or an academic, or a YouTuber, or a podcaster, or a spiritual guru, whatever. I can just listen for just a few minutes, and I can already understand how low or high is their perspective, and there's many degrees of it, right? So I can kind of peg them where they're at, what their understanding of epistemology is, because your understanding of epistemology determines everything. It's really a question of how deeply do you understand epistemology. And all of these points, this criteria that I'm giving you is really these are just tests for how well one understands the workings of your own mind. And so once you know all these tricks of the mind and you master all of them because you understood how you tricked yourself into believing all this shit, then you can instantly recognize it everywhere around you when people are talking. And they will not be able to know, but you'll know their place in the hierarchy of things, in the hierarchy of truthfulness, let's say, and consciousness. Another criteria of lower perspectives is that they tend to be monopolistic. They want to monopolize knowledge. They want a monopolistic worldview. It's like Islam is the best and truest religion, and everything else is inferior. That kind of attitude. That's what I mean by monopolistic. Or it could be scientific too. Science also likes to monopolize knowledge, and science will say scientific method is the best and truest and only way to understand reality. See, that's a kind of monopolization that happens. Or it could even happen at very advanced non-dual levels where people will say, non-duality is the ultimate truth and that non-duality is the end-all be-all. And there's nothing beyond just enlightenment. That can also be a very subtle form of monopolizing. Another criteria of lower perspectives is a lack of nuance, inability to recognize and appreciate subtle distinctions. So I have an episode called Learning Equals Making Distinctions, hugely important episode. And I have an episode called Understanding Duality, Part 1, Part 2, Part 3, where we talk about dualities, which are also identical to distinctions. So distinctions are a fundamental notion that I've talked about before, but really the mind's ability to make finer and finer distinctions is an honest signal of the quality of the mind. So a low-quality mind has very gross, sloppy distinctions and therefore makes a lot of mistakes. And a very high-quality, experienced mind is able to make very fine distinctions. For example, a low-quality mind will say that all of Christianity is bullshit. A higher-quality mind will say, wait a minute, not all Christians are the same. There's a billion Christians on the planet. Some of them are lower, some of them are in the middle, and some of them are very high and advanced. So we have to make distinctions when we're talking about Christians. We can't just lump them all together. Likewise, a low-quality mind will say all black people are intellectually inferior to white people based on IQ, science, and that kind of thing, right? This is sort of like standard kind of like white supremacist ideology. A higher quality mind will say, wait a minute, this is a much more complicated issue. You can't just lump all black people together, and you can't just do a few simple IQ tests because even IQ is a man-made construct, and there's biases within how we measure IQ and what intelligence is, and does IQ really track with intelligence? So see, now you're making distinctions. You're making a distinction between IQ and intelligence. These are not the same thing. But if you have a simple mind, it doesn't make that distinction. And it's convenient not to make that distinction if your agenda is to elevate your own race above the other races that you dislike for personal, prejudices that you have. It's very convenient not to make that distinction. But if you're intellectually honest and you take responsibility, you start to have to make these various kinds of intellectual distinctions between different races and IQs and how IQs are measured. And then you develop more and more nuance And this becomes harder and harder. The mind becomes more complex. And this is really what cognitive development is all about, is developing this kind of nuance. So low quality perspectives tend to be black and white thinking, using a lot of oversimplification of complex issues and overgeneralization. For example, this notion of the Jews run the world. Where does this come from? Fundamentally, it comes from a lack of just making subtle distinctions. Because first of all, you're lumping all Jews together into one monolithic group, which they're not. Jews disagree about many things. Many Jews in America, for example, don't support the Zionist actions that are being taken by conservatives who are controlling Israel. So you have to make a fine distinction between Jews and Israel national policy. These are not the same things. And then when you say Jews run the world, again, you have to make finer distinctions there. What does it mean to run the world? Who really runs the world? There's like so much you can get into there, right? So this comes from a sort of an oversimplification of a complex issue. And it can even get to the point where, and this is like the problem with Kanye West. You know, Kanye West went on this sort of like rant a few years ago where he was ranting against the Jews controlling Hollywood and all this sort of stuff. But it was obvious that the reason Kanye West is a great example of a lower perspective is because it was obvious that, first of all, his whole worldview or perspective in that regard, regarding the Jews, was based on personal grievance. And he's admitting this himself. You know, he talks about how Jewish lawyers and doctors and business people in Hollywood screwed him out of money from his music deals and screwed him out of this and screwed him out of that. And sure, that might have happened. Nobody's denying that. Were there a few Jewish people that Kanye West ran into who behaved unethically and did bad things to him? Okay, sure, okay, fine. But I mean, what does this really prove, right? You need to make subtler distinctions. Just because you had one bad Jewish doctor or a few bad Jewish accountants or lawyers and a few bad business deals with Jewish executives, that does not mean that Jews run the world or that Jews are against you or Jews are against black people. This is going too far. It's an overgeneralization and oversimplification of a very complex issue. There might be important historical reasons why there are many Jews in Hollywood or in the business world, and you can research that, right? But this requires a lot of nuanced thinking. But then to come out and say, as Kanye West did, you know, the Jews are doing this and the Jews are doing that, again, like these gross overgeneralizations. Because it's not the Jews that did that to him, it's individual Jews that did that to him, right? And then also what he would have to do is he'd have to compare about like, how many times was he screwed over by non-Jews, by just regular old American white people, or by black people, or by Asian people, right? You have to also consider that the business world is very cutthroat. If you do a lot of business, you're going to have bad deals. People are going to screw you over. People are going to steal money from you. All sorts of nasty stuff is going to happen. And if you have relationships, you're going to have a lot of bad relationships. People will cheat on you and lie to you, right? Just because you have a handful of bad relationships with women doesn't mean that all women are nasty or power hungry or manipulative or cheaters or sluts or whatever. But a lot of men, they just have a few bad experiences with women, overgeneralize. Why? Because they were so emotionally hurt. See, it's coming from emotional attachment. You were hurt by a few women. Now you need to get back at them. You were hurt by a few Jewish business executives. Now you need to get back at them. Your mind needs to explain it to you somehow. And it goes for these overly simplified, low-quality explanations. Another feature of lower perspectives is that they're very conformist. Very, very conformist. Because what's happening really is that the mind is just picking the first worldview or perspective or ideology that comes its way. Christianity, Islam, just like picking it off the shelf, libertarianism, if you were exposed to that, and you're just basically exposed to one of these ideologies early in your life just by happenstance, by chance of where you were born, who your family was, which school you went to, what friends you hung out with. And oftentimes there's a little trick that's played here by the mind, which is this, is that the mind will trick you to think that, oh, well, Leo, I'm not being conformist, I'm a libertarian. That's not conformist. We're pretty rare. Libertarians are pretty rare. Or it's like, I'm a neo-Nazi. Neo-Nazis are not conformist. It's the mainstream people who are conformist. The neo-Nazis were doing something pretty in a minority, because most people are not neo-Nazis or white supremacists. Or, Leo, I'm an anti-vaxxer. As an anti-vaxxer, I'm the rebel. I'm not conformist. Conformists are the normies who are taking the vaccine. They're the normies. This is a trick, because all of these, what we might call like minority positions, like libertarianism, maybe Marxism, anarchism, anti-vax stuff, even flat earth, this is all conformist. You didn't invent this ideology. You didn't sit and think through and come to this through independent analysis. I guarantee you that you didn't. You conformed to it. Just because you think that you're being contrarian, like those kids in school, who try to be rebellious in a conformist way. It's very laughable and kind of comical. The goth kids, the punks, the emo kids, they convince themselves that they're being nonconformist, but they're being very conformist. The only reason you're a goth is because of conformity. There's no human being would become a goth independently by themselves of their own, creative workings of their mind. This is a brain dead thing. You're just being an ape. You're just aping somebody else around you. You're not thinking independently. And so this is one of the key hallmarks of lower perspectives, is that they're conformist, that there's no independence of thought, even though you might trick yourself into thinking that you're being independent. Because of course, who wants to admit that they're just conformist? Nobody does. It's just kind of like with truth. Everybody thinks that their worldview is true, and everybody thinks that they're not conformist, but that they're an individual and that they're a rebel, because this is much more sexy to believe that. So be careful here. You can be a conformist in a mainstream way, or you can be a conformist in an alternative way. For example, MAGA is conformist, even though it pretends to be rebellious against the establishment. So the anti-establishment wave, this populist wave that we see happening in our politics, whether it's MAGA or left-wing progressive populism, this is all conformity. It's conformist to the extreme, but it masquerades as though it's being something unique and hip and kind of cool and edgy. It's like, Joe Rogan is so nonconformist, right? It's like, no, Joe Rogan is like super, super conformist. You have to understand. All of the mainstream podcasters are super conformist. They're not doing anything original. They're not really thinking, they're not deeply thinking through their positions. So that's a trap. Another aspect of lower perspectives is that they adopt a cookie cutter worldview from pop culture. So they're very almost too in touch with pop culture. And this leads to worldviews that are basically memes, perspectives that are memes. You're thinking in terms of memes, all this stuff that is happening on 4chan, for example. The reason 4chan is a lower quality perspective is because it's all meme-based. It's so conformist. Even when they're doing very edgy political stuff on 4chan, it's all so conformist and just so tied in with pop culture. Even the words and the language, the jargon that they use is so cookie cutter. Yes, they're a little micro community, they're a little subculture, but just because you have invented or joined some sort of subculture like a cult, In the most extreme example, you join a little cult, right? A cult is so small, how could you call it conformist? But of course, when you join a cult of 50 people, that's extremely conformist. And so it is when you join some community on the internet. If you're on some incel forum, that whole incel subculture is super conformist. It's super cookie cutter. It's super tied in with pop culture. That's why these people are into anime and they're into certain kinds of music and they're into certain kinds of like pop cultural stuff and they listen to certain kinds of influencers and they have a certain kind of politics and it's like very, very predictable. So one of the hallmarks of a low quality perspective is that it's super predictable, the way that kind of mind works. The way a Christian mind works, you can predict it. You can predict all the objections, all the arguments, all the evidence. It's all very predictable. And so it is with Islam, with many Buddhists, with many New Agers. Just like at some point, you realize that nobody is doing any independent thinking at all, no matter which of these worldviews they have. True independence of mind is so, so, so rare that when you actually experience it, it's a breath of fresh air. It's none of this kind of like MAGA stuff, anti-vax stuff, flat earth stuff, QAnon stuff, Marxist, like no, none of that is independent thinking. It's all thinking in cliches. So another hallmark of low quality perspectives is low mental autonomy. Fundamentally, what's going on is that the mind is not independent. It is enmeshed with its culture and its social circle and its tribe. Low mental autonomy means it's reliant on authority figures and consensus and really fitting in, which means that there's a lack of basic questioning, a lack of independence of mind, and low questioning of authority. For example, and it gets very tricky because you might think like, well, people who subscribe to MAGA, the MAGA worldview, they love to question authority because they're challenging the sort of like neoliberal or liberal establishment, right? So they're challenging authority, but not really because you're subscribing to the authority of Trump and it's becoming a Trump cult. And also these people are so predictable, like it's so easy to predict MAGA people because they're mostly all Christians. They're sort of like patriotic. There's like a handful of just like these sort of like cliches that they all hit on. So they're not really challenging authority. They're actually relying on authority. They believe everything Trump says, for example. They don't question it. So a low quality perspective is one that questions everything but itself. And a high quality perspective is one that primarily questions itself. It turns that responsibility inward into self-reflection. Low quality perspectives speak reflexively without pausing to think. They speak in cliches and talking points and engage in endless blabbermouthery and unconscious speech. To be able to speak intelligently about any domain, accurately, to make sense of that domain and then to communicate it to others, this is much more difficult than people know. Right now, we are in this sort of like zeitgeist moment of social media and influencers and podcasters where people are paid millions and even hundreds of millions of dollars to blabbermouth endlessly about everything and anything. This is a perversion. This is a perversion of culture and of the mind. Really, what needs to happen is that you need to speak infrequently and very, very carefully, because when you have a higher perspective and you reach that higher perspective through a lot of epistemic work, what you realize is that it's so tricky to understand reality and any domain of reality that you have to be very careful about what you say. You can't just blabbermouth the first thing that comes to your mind, because the first thing that comes to your mind and even the third thing that comes to your mind is going to be wrong. It's going to be self-deception. Somebody who didn't go through the process doesn't understand that, and they think that what they're saying is brilliant. It's gold. All the bullshit that comes out of their mouth, they think is gold. But somebody who's gone through a deep process of understanding the depth of human self-deception and the ego mechanism that is at work here, the more that I do this work, the less that I speak. Some of you wonder, Leo, why has there not been so many videos released? You used to release videos every week very consistently for years, and now you're sometimes not releasing for a year. Why is that? There's many reasons, but one of the reasons is that my understanding of myself and the mind and self-deception and epistemology has become so profound that I hesitate to even speak because I'm so conscious of anything that I say, how wrong it is from a certain point of view. Even when I say the right things and truthful things, I'm so cognizant of it's true for me in this context, from this point of view, at this particular point in time, at my current development level, at my current consciousness level, and then a year from now, it won't be true anymore, right? I'm so cognizant of that. Therefore, I hesitate to even speak. Whereas in the past, 10 years ago, I was able to just turn on the camera and start just blabbermouth and stuff. That's the process. So when you hear somebody who just can't shut up, that's one of the ways you know that their understanding of reality is quite low. Because when you really understand what's going on, it shuts you up. And you're very careful about what you say because you understand how easy it is to misspeak. Even when you understand, even when you've had your awakenings and so forth, still you should hesitate about speaking about God because it's very easy to say something misleading about God. Whereas a fundamentalist religious person will pontificate about God, even though they haven't even had an experience of God, but yet they're pontificating about they know what heaven and hell is. Really? You have no idea what heaven and hell are. You have no experience of it, no insight of it. And yet here you are pontificating, trying to convince others. And see, trying to convince others, it's actually a tell. It's a giveaway. You know, in poker, they have tells. Well, one of the tells of the ego mind is that when it doesn't really know something, what it does is that it overcompensates and it acts like it does. And so therefore, you might not know anything about God or religion, and you become a preacher. You might say, well, that's kind of counterintuitive, but actually, no, it's exactly what you should expect. You should expect that a preacher doesn't know what he's talking about. Why? Because he became a preacher to overcompensate for his lack of understanding of God. If he understood God, he wouldn't need to be a preacher. See? That's why a lot of times moralistic people, they love to preach to you about how evil you are and how important morality is. Usually those are the people who are the most evil themselves and who do a lot of evil stuff in the shadows, and they're overcompensating. Because if you were truly moral and good and had not a single evil bone in your body, you wouldn't need to moralize to anybody. Another feature of lower perspectives is ethnocentrism, tribalism, and extreme in-group bias. Us versus them mentality, loyalty to your team winning and surviving versus the truth. If your top priority is the survival of your tribe, and by tribe I mean your family, your friend circle, social circle, your colleagues at work, maybe your corporation, your nonprofit group, your religious community or group, your city, your county, your state, and your country, if any one of those or a combination of those is your top priority in life, you're never going to have a high quality perspective on the world. Why is that? Because all of your attention is going towards defending this narrow set of interests. as opposed to pursuing genuine inquiry into the truth. And the truth is a universal thing. It's not a local, narrow thing. It's not a tribal thing. So this is a dead giveaway of low-quality perspectives. It's like, our team has to win and your team has to lose. Whenever a perspective frames reality in that way, there's the good guys, which is us, and there's the bad guys, everybody else. It's like our cult are the chosen ones, and anybody who doesn't join our cult, they're the wicked ones. Anyone in our religion are the good guys, they're going to heaven, and the ones that are not are going to hell. Any of this kind of thing, even at the level of like sports teams, my sports team has to win and yours has to lose, and when yours lose, I'm happy, and when mine loses, I'm sad. This dynamic shows you that you're dealing with a low-quality mind, because a high-quality mind has transcended these petty human, tribal, local distinctions and attachments. It's universal, because reality is universal, truth is universal, God is universal. No tribe is special with God. The Jews don't have a special relationship with God that makes them extra special. That's not how it works. If somebody is telling themselves that, they're fooling themselves. They're not being open enough, right? They're not being aware enough of their own biases. So what happens is that as your mind develops and expands, you become aware that, I'm giving my own tribe and worldview sort of a preferential treatment, and that this is really coming from a kind of narcissism, not from truth. And if you were genuinely inquiring into the truth, let's say you were a Jew, and your whole childhood you were taught that Jews are the chosen people, the favorite people of God, that they got it special with God. At some point you would have to ask yourself, wait a minute, do Jews really have something special with God as opposed to everybody else? Or is that just a sort of a kind of like tribal narcissism that is a holdover from thousands of years ago? And if you actually honestly investigate that, you'll realize that, of course, there's nothing special about Jews and God. And that, in fact, that's a hallmark of a lower quality perspective. And again, within Judaism, we could make finer distinction. We could say there are lower quality Jews and higher quality Jews. The lower quality Jews are the ones that believe that they really got something special with God. Only if you're a Jew can you know God. Nobody else can truly know God. Some people might know a little bit, but only the true Jew, knows God fully. This would be a low quality perspective. A higher quality Jew perspective would be like, it would be a little bit more flexible, and it would say, there's this kind of myth that Jews have a special relationship with God, but this isn't really what's going on. This is just some sort of holdover, mythological holdover from thousands of years ago. It's infected with a little bit of bias and, tribalism going on there, a little bit of spiritual narcissism going on. And so that kind of Jew can appreciate that a Christian and a Muslim can have the same kind of relationship with God as a Jew. That would be a more open-minded, higher quality perspective, a more universal perspective. So lower quality perspectives have narrow, self-centered ethical frameworks. They have a low scope of consideration, narrow focus on immediate and personal concerns. Their whole MO is to maximize gain for self and for tribe at the expense of others and the environment. So lower from higher is also distinguished by how selfish you are. The more selfish you are, the lower you're going to be. The less selfish, the higher you're going to be. And selfishness here doesn't just pertain to you individually, but also to your tribe. So if all you care about is the preservation of your spiritual community, for example, your Muslim community, you might say, well, Leo, I'm not selfish. I've given my entire life to defending Islam. That makes me selfless. No, that makes you very selfish. Because true selfishness in this case would be that you're not just fighting for a narrow tribe, you're working for the betterment of mankind, and even beyond mankind, you're even transcending the narrow boundary of mankind. Your understanding and compassion extends to animals and aliens and everything else beyond. That would be true selflessness. So, and also even the environment, right? When you're very selfish, you're so selfish you don't even care about the environment. To care about the environment requires a certain degree of selflessness. So one way that you can tell how high a perspective is to what extent is it ecologically aware? Lower perspectives are not ecologically aware. They don't care about destroying the physical earth environment, but they also don't care about destroying, for example, the business environment, the economic environment. And they also don't care about the ecological epistemic environment, the information ecosystem. They don't care about that either. Because to care about these things would require a pretty advanced mind to even understand why caring about these things is important. So usually a lower perspective is going to actually leech resources from the environment, from different environments. It's going to leech resources from the physical environment, Earth. It's going to leech resources from the business environment, running some kind of scam. This is going to be hurting the environment. You know, maybe you're like in some industry, like you're in the insurance industry, but you don't do healthy insurance. You do some sort of scam insurance pyramid scheme. So you're actually, when you're doing that, you're not only are you scamming individuals, but you're also hurting the insurance industry as a whole, because people are going to start to distrust insurance if you run too many scam insurance schemes, right? So you're doing that as well because you don't care, because you're so selfish. And you're also polluting the information ecosystem. For example, Fox News, one of the problems with Fox News is that they pollute the information ecosystem with misinformation, propaganda, cherry-picked narratives, overgeneralizations, demonizations, tribalism, and so forth, right? So if you actually went through the process of genuine truth-seeking, you would have such a respect for truth that you would not be able to do what Fox News does, and you would not be able to work at Fox News. Because to be able to work at Fox News, you have to be okay with shitting in the epistemic ecosystem. That's like going to the pool and shitting in a public pool. See, a mature adult cannot do that. A child can do that and think it's funny. A mature adult cannot do that. So that's exactly what's going on with Fox News. But see, it's much harder to see it with Fox News because most people don't even understand that there is such a thing as an epistemic information ecosystem and how important that is to the development and health of mankind and society. It takes a lot of work to be conscious of that. And also, you have to let go of your own needs, right? What if I want to take a shit really bad, but I'm in the pool? Well, if I'm very selfish, I'll just shit in the public pool. But if I got to go really bad, it's an inconvenience to get out of the pool, run to the toilet. Maybe the toilet is broken. I got to run to another toilet. That's inconveniencing me. And so it is when you're doing a podcast. It's inconvenient when you're doing a podcast and, tomorrow you need to do your podcast, but you don't have any information. You don't have any genuine insights to share with people, but you still got to do your podcast. It's very inconvenient. So you're just going to come up with some bullshit on the fly. You're going to spitball some conspiracy theories on the fly on your podcast. And hey, good, great. You sold $10,000 worth of advertisement. Your audience is happy, but you're blissfully unaware of how you've corrupted the epistemic information ecosystem. See? It's like, well, but Leo, if I can't shit in the epistemic ecosystem, how am I supposed to do a regular weekly podcast? Yeah, that's very inconvenient. You'll have to do a lot less podcasts. Then you'll understand my situation. So another characteristic of lower perspectives is that the belief and the worldview is based on social survival primarily and fitting in within some kind of social circle. You're adopting beliefs to fit in with your friend circle or with your online forum community that you're part of, 4chan or whatever, or your Discord server, or your family, or your church. Because the reality for most people is that truth doesn't matter. For most people, what matters is fitting into their social circle. As long as you can fit into your social circle at work, you can get deals, you can make money, you can get promoted, you can climb the corporate hierarchy. With your friends, you can get lovers, relationships, and sex, have children and reproduce. That's all survival stuff. Great. Gets you feeling emotions of love. That's beautiful for you. You want that. And then if you're a podcaster or a YouTuber, you have an audience, you have a community of followers. So you're now incentivized to deliver worldview and beliefs and take on perspectives that they agree with, because who wants to deal with an audience who disagrees with you? It's very painful. I've gone through that. Trust me, it's painful. When your audience is very critical of you, you do things that they dislike. You're losing followers. That doesn't feel very good. You're losing advertisers. That doesn't feel good. Right? So you're always incentivized to deliver and to believe things. It goes so deep. It's not just that you're delivering perspectives that they agree with. There's a kind of an audience capture there, as it's called. But it's so subtle that you're even believing this stuff even way earlier before you even deliver it. You're starting to believe it because you need to believe it. You don't even know that you need to believe it, but you start to believe it because it's just going to make your life so much smoother with your advertisers, with your clients, with your lovers, with your friends, online friends, with your offline friends. Lower quality perspectives use worldview and perspective as a survival tool primarily in order to get money, fame, sex, approval, love, power, success, and influence. There's no real interest in truth. That's what it's used for. And that's what a lot of Christians and Muslims, and frankly, even Buddhists and Jews, Hindus, use their religion for. Primarily, human religion is not about God. It's not about truth-seeking. It's not about salvation. It's about none of that stuff. It's really about social fitting in. That's why you go to church every week. From going to church every week, you develop social connections, you develop friendships, you develop business connections, you develop lovers, and you get sex from it. And that really hits all the main things that a human ego needs and wants and craves, really, craves. And this is where grifting comes from. So lower quality perspectives, if you wonder, the word grift is overused a lot these days, but also there's a lot of grifters online in the podcast space, in the YouTube space, a lot of social media influence grifters. So who are the grifters? The grifters are the people who have low intellectual integrity. They don't care about epistemology or truth. All they see is a large audience. They can peddle to that audience whatever the audience wants to hear. That's the best way to make it in the social influence space. Just give people exactly what they want. Don't challenge them. Don't push them to be their higher self. Just feed all of their reptilian brain animal desires. Sell them the kind of products that their ego, animal, reptile brain wants. And that's the best way to become famous, successful, get sex, get power, get influence, all the good stuff, get a bunch of followers. See, if you're not living for some higher truth seeking, then you're just going to fall right down into that. Lower perspectives have a high degree of emotional attachment. This is a really critical, honest signal. You can't fake this. When you have an emotional attachment, this is not something you can fake your way out of. And so you can tell that these Christians, these Muslims, these Jews, these Zionists, these libertarians, these anti-vaxxers, white supremacist people, these MAGA people, it's all emotional attachment, pure emotional attachment. That's where their worldview comes from. It doesn't come from truth-seeking. And you can tell by prodding them. When you prod them, you can see they get angry, they get emotional, they get very defensive, they're easily offended, they're easily triggered, they're easily threatened, because what they have is ideological attachment. And that ideology is serving some sort of more basic survival. They're using the ideology to survive, to get sex, to get money, to get success, to get fame, to feel good about themselves, to get an ego boost, to feel powerful. These kind of people get easily outraged by radical ideas and perspectives. They act out emotionally. They create a lot of drama. Why? Because the drama is a defense mechanism. When you stir up a lot of drama, it precludes and truncates any kind of genuine truth-seeking. Because now you got to deal with the drama. You can't do truth-seeking when you're bitter, angry, outraged, depressed, because those emotions are going to twist and distort your entire thinking process. You're not going to think straight when you're angry. See, if you're angry at some racial group or you're angry at women, you're not going to have a proper view of that racial group or of women. If you're angry at socialists, you're not going to have a proper understanding of socialism. If you're angry at capitalists, you're not going to have a proper understanding of the business world and of capitalism. Lower perspectives are egocentric. They're infested with egoic attachment. They're narcissistic. They're very fragile to criticism. They take criticism personally, not as a point of improvement. See, if you were doing genuine truth-seeking, you would welcome criticism. You would welcome when somebody comes and points out a contradiction in your worldview. You would say, thank you, oh my God, I would have been deluded my whole life, but you pointed out to me that my thinking about Christianity was wrong. Oh, thank you. Thank you. You freed me from the delusions of Christianity, right? See, you don't hear Christians talk like this. Lower perspectives have a tendency to personalize disagreements because they're so based in ego, they're so self-absorbed that everything is interpreted as personal, because to them, life is personal. It's all about personally defending yourself, defending your personal relationships with other people and within your community, right? It's just like your life is so personal, it's not universal. You're not living universally. You're living selfishly, narcissistically. You're not questioning yourself. You're not questioning how you're living. Lower perspectives have a tendency towards aggressive arrogance and pride, moral righteousness, and this crusading, this lesser jihad mentality. Let's go on a crusade to smite the evildoers, the evil ones, the wicked ones, this kind of stuff. But you see, this is an externalization of what should really be an introspective process. What needs to happen here is, rather than being morally righteous, you got to look at your own moral failings. This would be the proper, mature approach of a higher perspective. The greater jihad versus the lesser jihad. Look, greater and lesser are right in the titles. And that's the difference between the greater and the lesser perspectives. The greater jihad is the higher perspective, and the lesser jihad is the lower perspective. So the lower perspectives are judgmental, moralistic, demonizing, a lot of demonization. The more somebody demonizes somebody else, the lower their mind is. Now, look, I still have more of these criteria to give you, but just a point here, a sort of a meta point, is that I'm giving you this criteria, but it's important that you don't just take the criteria as a given, but that you also think about and start to understand why each of these criteria are the case. Like, so what you should be asking yourself is this. You should be asking yourself, what is it that makes demonizing others and other perspectives a lower perspective? Why would that be lower? For example, why can't there be a very high, advanced, developed mind that demonizes some group of people in society? Why can't that be the case? Why would that be wrong? What is the actual causal connection between demonizing and lower perspective? Each of these points that I'm giving you like 50 points here. Each of them is so profound that you could contemplate it for months just to understand why it's the case, right? And I don't have enough time here. Already, we've been talking for 2 hours, and there's so much more I could say about each one of these points where I could actually give you the causal connection, but that would require like many more videos to explain every causal connection. But let's just do one really quick here just so that you have an example of it, and then you'll do this. I expect you to, as a homework assignment, to do this for all the rest of them yourself, because I just don't have time to explicate all of it. So why is it the case that demonizing others and other perspectives necessarily puts you into a low perspective yourself? See, I don't even have an answer right off the top of my head. I have to think about it. What's the actual causal connection? Well, it's because in reality, nothing is demonic. So if you're demonizing something, it's a projection. It has to be a projection. And if you're demonizing something, this implies that you're actually believing it. You're taking it seriously. It's not just like a fake front or a sort of just like a game that you're playing. You actually believe it, assuming that you're actually demonizing someone and you believe it. Like, for example, if you genuinely believe that Nazis are demons, what's wrong with that? Well, you could say, well, but Leo, Nazis are bad, so what's wrong with demonizing them? Yeah, but like, if you really believe that they're demons, like, there's different degrees of demonization. So one degree is just to say that somebody is bad. That's not, I mean, there's problems even with that. Because again, see, even in the case of like, let's say somebody is just bad, in a mild way. I mean, they're not murderers or genociders. They're just bad in some mild way. Even that, see, when you call something bad and you genuinely believe it, what your mind is not recognizing that's happening from your point of view. The reason something is bad is not because it's objectively bad or absolutely bad. It's bad relative to your perspective, relative to your selfish needs and ego. Such that you can realize that if you didn't have a self, nothing would be bad. You think, well, no, Nazis are just bad. No, Nazis are bad because you have a sense of self, which wants to avoid suffering and other things like that. It's only because you have certain needs that need to be fulfilled for you to be happy. That's why something is bad. But most people aren't conscious of this. So they will just demonize whatever their ego happens to not like. That doesn't serve them, right? So a higher perspective, a higher mind is self-aware enough to understand that, oh, when I'm calling somebody or something bad, what that really means is that I'm being selfish and I have my own biases and needs. I have emotional needs. Even if I'm very advanced, I still have emotional needs, right? I still want to avoid suffering. I still want to protect my family, etc. So a higher mind recognizes that it's projecting its own biases and selfishness into these situations where it's saying that something is bad, whereas a lower mind isn't doing that. So in this sense, demonization can only happen at a low level of consciousness. At a high level of consciousness, you realize there are no demons and nothing is genuinely bad other than just like what you need for your survival. That's the difference. Okay, you see, so I just derived that right here on the spot. I didn't have this prepared. I didn't think it through. I thought it through with, you saw me thinking it through. Now, I want you to do that with every other point. For example, let's take the next point of lower perspectives, is that Lower perspectives tend to be highly opinionated and take one's own opinions too seriously. They're unwilling to let go of their own opinions. So now my question to you is, why is it the case that being highly opinionated and unwilling to let go of opinions puts you at a low perspective? You answer that yourself. The next point is that lower perspectives are eager to debate, argue, win, and own others. And you see this with the sort of online debate bro culture. We got to own the other side. It's this tribal team mentality. Also, you got to wonder, like, and you can experience this in yourself. If you've ever argued or debated with anybody, you've felt this. It's like you feel a certain pleasure when you're winning in a debate. It's a kind of a sick pleasure. And also you feel a kind of a sick displeasure when you're losing in a debate. Whether it's an online debate, in-person debate, doesn't matter. You can introspect and feel into that. See my video called Developing Introspection for that ability. You can introspect into that, and you can feel that there's something dirty about it. And what's dirty about it is that it's based on ego, right? Because look, if you knew the truth, let's imagine you were omniscient. You knew the truth about everything in the universe. Why would you care to debate, argue, or win, or own anybody? It wouldn't matter to you. Also, if you were totally selfless, it wouldn't matter to you either. This is a cheap little dopamine hit that your reptile brain gets, is to win an argument over somebody, right? So a higher mind just completely lets go of that dynamic. It doesn't care. It doesn't care about that little dopamine hit. Why not? Because knowing the truth is a much bigger serotonin hit than the little dopamine hit that you get from owning somebody online with some nasty, snarky little comment. Also, because a higher quality mind understands that argumentation and debate is not the same thing as genuine inquiry and insight and consciousness into things. You can win a debate, but be wrong. You can lose a debate and be right. So why does a debate matter? Why does it matter who wins? There are many cases of debates where somebody wins in a debate just through sheer charisma, bluster, and performance, and just likability, presentation, looking good, but there's no substance there, there's no truth there, there's no deep consciousness there, there's no deep insight there, there's no deep sense-making. The next criteria is that lower perspectives are based on lower emotions. This is a huge connecting point. Lower perspectives are based on fear, hatred, resentment, bitterness, nihilism, vindictiveness, xenophobia, cynicism. And energetically, they feel negative, bitter, toxic, and angry. Anger is a huge one. If somebody or some perspective is coming from a place of anger, this is a huge telltale sign that it's a lower perspective. For example, just watch a speech of Hitler, one of those classic Hitler speeches, and just look at, you don't even need to read the subtitles, just listen to it in the original German. You don't need to even know what he's saying. If you're a non-German speaker, it's fine. But just like listen to the anger, the bitterness, the negativity, the vindictiveness, the kind of xenophobia, the resentment, the hatred that he is dishing out. And intuitively, you should be able to feel that that is wrong. Now, why is your intuition right about that being wrong? That's a deeper question. You know, your intuition can be wrong too. So you might wonder here, well, Leo, what if my intuition is wrong? Yeah, that's something for you to contemplate. Again, why is it that anger puts you in a lower perspective? Why can't you have a very high, sophisticated understanding of reality and also be deeply angry as Hitler was? Why can't those two things mesh together? Contemplate that. There's deep reasons why. See? the truth should not make you angry. If the truth is making you angry, it's for two reasons. One is it's making you angry because you had some kind of fantasy and the truth is actually disrupting or contradicting your fantasy. That's one. And two, the truth is making you angry because it's not actually the truth. You're confusing, again, truth with some sort of personal need you have. Like if you're angry at some race of people, or you're angry at women, or you're angry at men, you're angry at capitalists, that's not the truth. That's some personal egoic thing you got going on, some emotional needs you got going on that are not being handled. You're just not aware enough yet of that fact. That's a meta issue that is running you. It's a meta dynamic that's running you. You're like a puppet that is being puppeteered, and you're like a marionette, and you don't see the strings yet. Consciousness and higher development, higher perspectives, allows you to see the strings that are puppeteering you, and these strings are emotional for the most part. So eventually you see the anger string that is attached to your head and to your mouth. And then you see that and you're like, oh, okay, I can't do that anymore. I can't just go out and rant angrily about somebody and then believe that I'm being truthful. It's like, that's just silly. You become so conscious that it's silly for you to believe that your anger is actually something truthful. And that you can make sense of reality from a place of anger. You can't. You can't understand women if you're pissed off at them for hurting you. See? And you can't understand Nazis if you're pissed off at them for killing your grandparents in the gas chambers. You can't. You can't make sense of Nazism that way because your emotions are going to cloud your understanding. To understand something, you have to be objective and outside of your biases. Lower perspectives are selfish, self-serving, manipulative, and exploitative. They seek to extract value. It's about extraction of value. Right? So like Andrew Tate has a certain worldview about men, about women, about society. And he postures as though he's some sort of champion of truth. But that's not what's going on there. What's going on there is that he's acting narcissistically, self-servingly, to manipulate not only the people who follow him, but even himself, to extract value from the men who follow him and the women who he deals with and who he employs in his business. He extracts value from them financially, but also sexually and in other ways. Right? So that's what that's about. It's about extracting value. He's a master at extracting value from men and from women. That's Andrew Tate's game. And then everything he speaks with his mouth is just noise to serve that function. But his followers and his women and even his own mind is not aware that this is going on, because to become aware of this entire dynamic, one would have to transcend his self and become conscious of all of these complex mechanics of the mind that I teach with this work, which is like 10 years of very painful, difficult work. Because if Andrew Tate was not able to extract value in the way that he is, how would he survive? What would he even do with his life? He'd need to live in a totally different way, which is very inconvenient for him. So what I want you to see is that the worldview and the perspective is so powerful, is so potent in terms of its survival function, that almost nobody who's in the lower perspectives, and there's a lot of degrees of lower perspectives, almost nobody in this bottom half of perspectives understands what's really going on. It's not that there's some sort of evil geniuses who are trying to fool you and the world. It's that they are themselves so deeply fooled by their own perspective. They really believe their perspective. Trump really believes his perspective. Andrew Tate really believes his perspective. Jordan Peterson, Elon Musk, flat earther, neo-Nazi, anti-vaxxer. All of these people are true believers, like true believers. So calling all these people just grifters it really underestimates the severity of the problem. I wish all these people were just grifters, because grifter implies that they really know better. And that they're just doing it for the money. They're not really true believers. But the sad reality is that they're not even conscious enough to understand that they're grifters. That's the real problem. Lower perspectives are authoritarian in their style. They're coercive and they're dominating. Why is this? Again, think about it. Why does authoritarianism correspond with a lower perspective? Why can't a really conscious, highly cognitively developed, truthful mind be authoritarian? Why not? It's because to be able to dominate somebody else, and domination can take many forms. It can be sexual domination, physical domination, political domination, geopolitical domination, invasion of a country, assassinating somebody, beating them up, stealing their girlfriend, even beating a dog. Or it can be intellectual domination. So it could be terrorism. So why is this lower, not higher? Because to do any of these things, you'd have to hold yourself as somehow fundamentally above or more important than whoever you're dominating. You believe you're entitled to dominate them. If you're dominating your wife in a relationship, you believe you're more important than your wife, you're better than your wife, you know better than your wife, your agenda is more important than your wife's perspective doesn't matter, her opinions don't matter, her beliefs don't matter, her sexual, autonomy doesn't matter. It doesn't matter when she wants to have sex, it only matters when you want to have sex. It doesn't matter what she believes, it only matters what you believe. It doesn't matter what her opinions about financial decisions in the relationship are, only matters what yours are, right? What am I describing here? Pure selfishness, pure self-absorption. You're so self-absorbed that you want the entire world and everybody in it to conform to your personal needs, emotional needs. So everybody in the world is just a tool to serve your own emotional needs. They're there to titillate you sexually, to solve your horniness problems, to give you money so you can extract money from them. They're there to give you applause and praise and fame and to prop you up, right? This is pure selfishness, egocentrism. So, but if you saw the consequences that this has on broader society and all of your relationships and how you're actually hurting others, if you had the empathy to see all these things, you would feel so miserable your mind actually couldn't maintain its coherence. You'd have an existential crisis. Your mind would collapse on itself. So in order to behave in this kind of authoritarian dominating way, you have to delude yourself. You need to construct a fantasy of how great and wonderful you are, how intelligent you are, how stupid everybody else is, how undeserving everybody else is, how below you they are. Therefore, you're justified in dominating them because they're stupid, they're weak, they deserve it. They don't have the same connection to God as you do. Whatever the rationalizations are, right? A higher mind is so advanced and so conscious of itself that it sees all these games that it's playing and it can no longer justify to itself being authoritarian towards others. For example, a higher mind can't just beat his wife and then have sex with her when she doesn't want to. can't do that because a higher mind respects the individual sovereignty of the wife. A lower mind that doesn't even recognize that the wife has her own sovereignty, intellectual sovereignty, that she's a god unto herself, that kind of mind can sexually, abuse the wife. And so it is when you're invading, like Putin invades Ukraine. Putin in his mind has to convince himself that Ukraine is not an actual entity. Ukraine has no sovereignty. Ukraine is literally just a part of Russia. If you convince yourself of that, then you're justified in dominating and coercing it. So lower perspectives lead to violence, domination, cheating, lying, and theft. And there are many kinds of theft. For example, when Donald Trump, during the Iraq War, he published an article in some magazine or newspaper or whatever, where he made a case for stealing the Iraqi oil. Take all of their oil. That's how a lower perspective thinks. Just, why not? If we're in Iraq already, just take all their oil as well. Why not? Who cares? I mean, it's like a child at a playground who just like sees some other kid playing with a toy, runs up, grabs the toy, hits him over the head, and runs away with the toy. I mean, that's the kind of behavior we're seeing here. Of course, this leads to the next criteria of lower perspectives, which is low empathy. It takes a lot of cognitive development to actually inhabit the perspectives of other people besides your own, because you have to step outside your own, step into theirs, see reality from their eyes. That takes like cognitive complexity. It's emotionally challenging to do that. It's much easier not to be empathetic, because if you're not empathetic, you can kill somebody and not care. If you actually are conscious of the suffering you're causing others, you won't be able to kill them. Lower perspectives are prone to conspiratorial thinking. Because, why? Because they're avoiding responsibility. See, what is the real driver of conspiracy theories? It's really an avoidance of responsibility. That's what a conspiracy theory, psychologically, the function that it serves. Conspiracy theories come in all sorts of flavors with all sorts of content. But what is the structure of conspiracy theories? What is its purpose? Its purpose is to give you an oversimplified narrative to make sense of something without independently thinking about it. You're grabbing it from some pop cultural source, even though it's a conspiracy theory and it's sort of like out of the mainstream. It's still all conformity. You're not really thinking. And on top of that, it allows you to avoid responsibility because now you don't have to seriously think about how the world really works. Now what you can do is you can focus on scapegoating and blaming others. Lower perspectives would rather blame than take responsibility. So that's exactly what they do. Somebody convenient to blame. The immigrants, the homeless people, the women, the gays, the transes, the blacks, the Asians, the Hispanics. Everyone's doing something wrong to you except yourself. That's a low perspective. A high perspective takes responsibility for all this and doesn't blame anybody and goes on making sense of reality from that point of view. That's a lot harder. Lower perspectives are also uncharitable to alternative views, misrepresenting them, misrepresenting alternatives, acting as though there are not alternatives, and engage in straw manning. So a lower perspective is going to straw man other perspectives. So if you ask a fundamentalist Christian to present a good faith, charitable alternative to Christianity, such as Islam, they will not be able to do it. They're simply going to be incapable of it because their mind doesn't even understand Islam well enough to be able to render it in a charitable, reasonable, sane way. So when you ask a fundamentalist Christian to, explain Islam, it's going to say that Islam is some kind of form of Satan worship or some sort of demonic perspective. And it's going to paint it as crazy and unreasonable, and that's it. And no matter how much you ask the Christian to steelman the Islamic worldview, they're just not going to be able to do it. Because to be able to steelman a perspective, you have to study it, you have to step outside your perspective, you have to be very open-minded, you have to bother to see it from another point of view, which is going to then threaten your perspective. Because anytime you step outside of your perspective, you realize that it's just a perspective. It's like clothes that you're wearing and you can step out of them. See? But lower perspectives are not able to do this kind of jumping because they don't have that kind of mental flexibility. So they do a lot of straw manning. And the straw manning just represents a lack of understanding. Because if you really understood Islam and Christianity and Judaism and Hinduism, you could steelman every single one of those. And that means you would be at a high perspective if you could do that. See, one of the reasons that Fox News is a lower perspective is that Fox News is incapable. Their anchors and presenters and commentators are literally incapable of rendering a steelman of socialism, progressivism, leftism, wokeness. Instead, all they do is they just engage in straw manning all day long. That's what Fox News is. It's just straw manning the left all day long. The next criteria for lower perspectives is that they use cheap and intellectually dishonest tactics, such as gaslighting, whataboutism, bullshitting, lying, cheating, name-calling, denial, counterattack, dodging questions, and false equivalency. You can find all of these tactics used every day on Fox News. It's their bread and butter. And see, a lower perspective disseminating this kind of stuff is not going to appeal to a higher perspective, but it will appeal to other lower perspectives. So Fox News is a low perspective designed for the majority of Americans, which also have low perspectives. So in this sense, it's successful and popular. That's why it is, because they're matching frequency. They're on the same wavelength. A lower perspective doesn't have enough intellectual honesty and integrity to recognize all these tactics. It confuses them for genuine truth-seeking. Lower perspective uses charisma, bluster, and bombast as a substitute for truth or inquiry. So rather than sitting for hours, locking themselves in a closet for hours, contemplating their political beliefs, on Fox News, somebody comes on Fox News and just does bluster and charisma and bombast, and just the louder they can scream, the more charismatic they can be, the more it feels like they have the truth. Whereas what I do is I literally lock myself in my closet for days, sitting there contemplating my political perspectives. That's the difference between a lower and higher perspective. See, when you don't do the closet thing, then you want to go out there and you just want to, scream and rant and rave about how right you are. And that's much, much easier, much more fun than locking yourself in a closet. I literally do that. I spend days, over the last week, I spent days just locked in my closet because in pitch black, I just sit in my closet. It's a pretty big walk-in closet. I sit in it and just contemplate reality. So you're wondering, what do I do? What do I do all day? It's very unglamorous, right? See, Andrew Tate is out there, driving his fast cars and, doing the bluster and bombast. I'm locked in a closet, contemplating stuff. That's why there's less videos. Another criteria of lower quality perspectives is double standards. A lot of double standards are being used. See my episode about double standards and hypocrisy. Search for that one. Very important episode. So see, when you have intellectual integrity, you don't allow double standards in your mind. For example, what's an example of a double standard? Like, in science, a double standard is something like, science wants everything to be proven in order to be believed, right? Or so they claim. But then there's a double standard because the scientific method itself cannot be proven. Because you can't know that everything, all phenomenon in the universe can be discovered through scientific method. That's not something you prove or science has ever proven. That's just an assumption. That's a belief. So see, if you were really intellectually integrous, you would recognize that there's a double standard at play within science. You would also recognize there's a double standard, for example, within religion. If you're a Christian, you give much more credence to your beliefs than that of a Muslim, with a double standard there. So these double standards are everywhere within your own mind and within different worldviews. And so a lower perspective has a lot of these double standards. It doesn't care about correcting them at all. It's in fact shameless about its double standards. This is another thing that's wrong with Fox News, is that they engage in so many ridiculous double standards. A standard that they hold for the Democrats that they don't hold for their own party. Like, if you think the Democrats are lying a lot and you talk about how often Democrats lie, you have to also talk equally as much about how Republicans lie, if they lie equally as much. If Republicans lie more than Democrats, then you have to talk more about how much Republicans lie, even if you're a Republican. See, this would be intellectual integrity. Does Fox News do this? No. Why not? Because its agenda is propaganda. Its agenda is not truth. Lower perspectives are engaged in denial games and maneuvers, intellectual maneuvers and mental gymnastics. Lower perspectives are extremely biased and unaware of the biases. They don't care about the biases. They embrace the biases. Lower perspectives conflate facts and data with interpretations. A lot of stuff that people who hold a low perspective will call just the facts are not the facts, they're interpretations. And the mind needs to be able to distinguish between facts and data and interpretations. This takes development work to develop that kind of capacity. And you also need to care to distinguish them. It's very convenient in many cases not to distinguish the difference between facts and interpretations, because everybody wants to present their interpretations as facts. I have an episode about interpretations. I forget what it's called. You can just search actualized interpretations. You'll find something. The next criteria is conflating one's own survival with truth, goodness, and objectivity. Lower perspectives do that. Again, a failure to distinguish. Lower perspectives also do a reification of human constructs. They take what are human constructs and then they reify them, turn them into universal objects. So Christianity is a human construct, but it's reified as actual reality, some sort of higher divine reality. No, Christianity is a human construct. So is Islam. So is Judaism. Science is also a human construct. Capitalism is a human construct. So on. Lower perspectives succumb to what I call the anthropocentric bias, which means just that there's an overemphasis on the human-centric style of explanations. Everything is explained or made sense of in terms of petty, small, narrow human biases and perspective. What's an example of this? For example, Christianity has this anthropocentric bias. For example, Christianity says that human beings have souls that go to heaven and animals do not. Well, how biased is that? Right? Talk about a double standard. Or just think about how ridiculous it is that Christians believe that, God appeared on Earth as Jesus. But what about all the other planets? There's like trillions of planets in the universe. Probably many of them have life. Maybe a lot of them have intelligent life, most likely. And what? God did not appear there? Only to humans God appeared in the form of Jesus? Or if you're Muslim, only to humans God appeared, or sent his messenger of Muhammad. I mean, this is preposterous, right? You see how deeply human-centered, just like there's egocentrism, there's homocentrism, right? You're so, like, everything in these religions is just so comically infested with human bias. It's laughable from higher perspectives. But from the lower perspective, you're so stuck in the human that you can't even see animals as having their own consciousness and their own sovereignty and intelligence. Because to you, animals are just objects for you to hunt and to fill your belly with, to dominate. Lower perspectives generalize without regard for context, treating fact as independent of context, so it lacks context awareness. Lower perspectives do not check sources. Don't bother to do that. That takes work. Also, don't bother to do research or fact-checking. Just assumes that everything's true, right? Does the average Fox News viewer bother to check Fox News, to fact-check them, to do research on Fox News, to actually maybe falsify some of the things that Fox News says? No, of course not. In fact, the average Fox News viewer is going to do the opposite, because the average Fox News viewer is going to subscribe to some secondary source like Breitbart News or OAN News or Ben Shapiro's outlet, Daily Wire, something like that, which is just going to create an echo chamber and reinforce all the stuff that's happening on Fox News. And that's going to make that kind of viewer think that, well, Fox News is doubly true because Fox News said it, Breitbart said it, Ben Shapiro said it, Steven Crowder said it, Alex Jones said it, so it must be true. Right? See, this is the kind of ridiculous stuff that happens at the lower perspectives. These kind of echo chambers get developed. The lower perspective cherry picks research and fact-checking as confirmation bias. So you might say, Leo, I do research and I do fact-checking as a right-winger. I do this kind of stuff. But what you really mean is that you just do the fact-checking and the research that confirms what you already want to believe. Doing objective research and fact-checking is quite challenging. You have to have a lot of intellectual integrity to do that well. And you also have to be very epistemically aware. You have to understand the quality of different sources. See, there's a difference between the quality of, let's say, a source like Wikipedia and Breitbart News. These are very different quality standards. Wikipedia has editorial standards. They're like an encyclopedia level of quality. That doesn't mean everything there is accurate and unbiased, but relative to Breitbart News or Fox News or Ben Shapiro News, Wikipedia is like in a different league of quality and accuracy and objectivity. But the average Ben Shapiro viewer doesn't know this and doesn't care. Because the point of watching Ben Shapiro is to have Ben Shapiro tell you exactly what you want to hear, not to challenge you. It's to feed your reptile brain for partisanship. That's what that is. And then you sit there and watch it like a sucker because you don't see the meta of what's really going on. You don't see the structure of what's going on. You're so lost in the content. Another criteria for lower perspectives is an inability to distinguish between correlation and causation. A lower perspective, a lower mind, sees that black people score lower on IQ tests and says, oh, well, that's because, of course, black people are genetically inferior intellectually. No, that's not what it means. It could mean a lot of other things. It could mean, for example, that black people have been historically disadvantaged and don't have enough money to send their children to better schools. That doesn't mean their intelligence is genetically inferior. It just means they haven't been going to different schools for cultural reasons, which could be corrected. Or it might mean that their nutrition, the kind of, projects and ghettos that they lived in, they don't get the right kind of nutrition, and the nutrition has an effect on the development of the brain. So it's not that their genetics are inferior. It's just that if you give them good nutrition, the way that, affluent people get, then their IQs will equalize. And it could mean many other things, right? So this is the difference between correlation and causation. Lower perspectives are also characterized by a misattribution of causality. They incorrectly identify causes and effects. Sometimes you see some sort of relationship between several variables, but you can get the causes and effects wrong. This is what good scientists are taught how to do, is how to distinguish between really finding the right causes and effects. For example, some anti-vaxxer might say, well, I know a couple of people in my family who took the vaccine and they died, or they had a heart attack, or they had some sort of complication. But again, just because you take a vaccine and you have a heart attack does not mean that the vaccine caused the heart attack. There could be a lot of other variables there. The heart attack could have been caused not by the vaccine, but, for example, by the stress that was created from losing your job because of the lockdowns. See, that's different. But an anti-vaxxer is so locked into the anti-vax agenda that they don't care about these subtle cause and effect things. In their mind, they already know that the vaccine causes lots of death. And then they everything else that they do is reasoning backwards from that conclusion. And the whole sort of like vaccines cause autism. Again, just because you have an autistic child who got a vaccine does not mean that the vaccine caused the autism. There's a lot of very complex factors there that need to be sorted out, which is why rigorous scientific research and double-blind studies and all that kind of stuff is necessary. But, a lower quality perspective doesn't trust science. Lower quality perspectives also oversimplify causality, tending to attribute complex events to simple, singular causes. So, for example, maybe the economy is not going well, and you say, well, the economy is not going well because it's those damn Democrat Marxists. Something like that. When in fact the Marxists are not in power. There are no Marxists in power in America, so they didn't cause a bad economy. Or you might say, well, the war in Ukraine, there's a war in Ukraine, and during Donald Trump's time, there was no war. And then when Biden came into power, there was war. So Biden was weak, and that's why the war started in Ukraine. This kind of simplistic causality. Lower perspectives do this. Lower perspectives also do a misattribution of agency, incorrectly assigning intentionality to random or natural events. For example, a common conspiracy theory that was floated a few years ago is that when there were fires in Hawaii, that it was caused by some sort of government space satellite with lasers, Jewish space lasers. I mean, it's ridiculous to even say these things. But we have people in Congress that believe this stuff. Again, see, a natural event like a fire, maybe it was caused by some electrical line or somebody throwing a cigarette out the window. But no, a low-quality mind is very conspiratorial, right? Needs somebody to blame. It's the Jewish Democrats, the Jewish liberals, they got space lasers that cause this stuff. Or they create hurricanes. This is also one of these right-wing conspiracy theories that was floating around. There was some hurricane in Florida, and then there was a conspiracy theory that it was some scheme by some liberals to create a hurricane. The government can create hurricanes. Yeah, it gets this ridiculous. Here we're scraping the bottom of the barrel, the lowest of the low here. Other criteria for low perspectives is an over-reliance on anecdotal evidence and unreliable methods. So again, the sort of COVID anti-vax stuff, it's like somebody who had some complication after the vaccine. It's anecdotal evidence. And then from that, you extrapolate out the vaccine is bad for everybody. See, even if your friend died from the vaccine, okay, but that doesn't mean it's bad as a policy. Doesn't mean it's bad for everybody. You haven't taken into account how many lives the vaccine has saved. Even if your whole family was killed by the vaccine, if you were truly objective, you would say, well, yeah, it really sucks that my family was killed by the vaccine, but maybe 10 other families were saved by the vaccine, and that was a worthwhile trade-off. Because again, see, if you're so selfish that all you care about is your stupid little family, then yeah, when you lose your family, you also lose your mind. You can't reason properly. That's what it means to be, attached to some sort of narrow tribal group. That's the problem with it. You can't run an entire country of 350 million people based on the particular situation of your one family. Your family might have some rare, unique genetic mutation that causes the vaccine to kill a whole family. Okay, but that doesn't mean that the rest of the population has that rare genetic mutation. Lower perspectives have a intolerance towards ambiguity and towards not knowing. They need to know. They can't just leave things uncertain. Also, a low capacity for contradiction and paradox. Also, ontological inflexibility. Rigid beliefs about the nature of reality and resistant to other ontologies. A Christian has a certain ontology and refuses any other ontology. An atheist or a materialist has a certain ontology and refuses to consider other ones, doesn't take them seriously. Another aspect of lower perspectives is a narrow scope, focused on limited aspects of reality while ignoring broader contexts. It's much easier to make sense of reality when you only focus on a small sliver of it and not larger, making sense of larger things. The more of reality you have to make sense of, the harder it gets. So minds, usually lower quality minds, will actually make it artificially easy for themselves by limiting the field of consideration for themselves. For example, a scientist working in some sort of laboratory doesn't need to think about all of reality, only needs to think about not even physics, but like some narrow aspect of physics. That's all he thinks about. That makes it much easier for him, but it means that his understanding is not going to work more universally, more broadly. Lower perspectives think of reality in isolated parts, not systemically. They are reductive and non-holistic because that's much easier. Lower perspectives have a static view of systems and ideas. They're non-evolutionary. So, for example, many Christians don't have an evolutionary view of their own Christianity. What I mean by that is I'm not talking about the evolution of mankind from animals. I'm just talking about Christianity itself as a religion and belief system has evolved. The Christianity of today in America is not the Christianity of 2,000 years ago, Jesus' times. So Christianity has changed a lot, but most Christians are just believing the current version of Christianity, which is very distorted and corrupted relative to what it was originally. They don't even know what it was originally. They don't even acknowledge that it changed. So Christians have multiple problems with evolution. Not only is it a problem in terms of man and animals, but it's also even a problem just within their own religion. If you look at the actual origins of Christianity, you see that it's borrowing elements from other religions that predated it, from pagan traditions, from various mystical and occult traditions. Also with science. Science is also evolutionary. Science changes as well, and many scientists are rather ignorant of the significance of this, even though they're generally aware of it. Another criteria of lower perspectives is they commit narrative fallacy, creating flawed stories to explain random events, imposing false meaning. Misses also patterns and invents self-serving patterns. It's very easy to cherry pick patterns from reality. You can literally walk outside and, see two birds sitting in a tree and then interpret that as the tree has eyes looking at you and is winking at you. Something like that. It's kind of projection. Or you see Jesus in a pancake sort of thing. You see God speaking messages to you in your SpaghettiOs soup or something. Alphabet soup. You're eating alphabet soup and there's some letters in there with your little spoon. God is sending you some messages. Something like that. Lower perspective tends to fall into that kind of trap. Lower perspectives also do lots and lots of projection. Just lots of projection. They can't distinguish between reality and their own projections onto reality. This leads to a lot of epistemic error and self-deception. Also, lower perspectives are resistant to metaphorical and abstract thinking. They can't think at high levels of abstraction and more metaphorically. They take things more literally. So one way to distinguish lower quality and higher quality forms of religion or religious worldview is that the more literal the religion is, the lower it is. So when a Christian tells you that literally the earth is 5,000 years old, because that's like, if you do the math inside the Bible, that's literally what it amounts to. That's a lower level of perspective than some Christian who says, a more sophisticated Christian will say that the Bible is more metaphorical, allegorical, mythological. So in this sense, for example, Jordan Peterson is a higher quality Christian because he's not a strict literalist. He doesn't read the Bible literally. And he makes, in fact, good arguments about why reading the Bible literally is not a very smart thing to do. You need to read it much more abstractly. That's correct. But there are many different levels of abstraction, and there's many beyond him. So keep that in mind. Lower perspectives are also characterized by a lack of existential thinking. Existential thinking means thinking fundamentally from scratch about the nature of reality, without any assumptions and without any human biases and without any beliefs, but like really thinking from scratch about the metaphysics of existence, or anything for that matter. Lower perspectives are also non-relativistic. They do not understand or appreciate relativity, and they will demonize relativity. This is why conservatives love to demonize relativism. It's a common trope that they are always parroting because they don't understand the profound nature of relativity, and that this doesn't contradict things like God or spirituality. This is actually an essential aspect of it. If you want more on relativity, see my episode, Understanding Relativism, Part 1, and I'll have a Part 2 soon. Lower perspectives also misuse and selectively apply relativism and skepticism to defend one's own belief systems. So they will use relativism and they will use skepticism, but only when it serves their worldview, which of course is a double standard. If you're going to use skepticism, you have to use it equally against other systems and your own. And if you're going to be relativistic, you have to apply that equally. You can't just cherry pick and apply relativism in ways that serve you. I discussed that in my episode called, what is it called? Absolute versus relative truth. Something like that. Also, lower perspectives flippantly dismiss experts and expertise. Why is that? Because they don't really care about the truth. They only want to use experts and expertise when it serves their agenda and their ideology. If it contradicts, then those experts need to be demonized and ignored. So, for example, an anti-vaxxer isn't interested in the expertise of real scientists who do research on vaccines and immune systems and so forth. They don't care about that. They don't trust those experts. And they have no awareness of the challenges of doing science on the immune system. It's way more difficult than these anti-vaxxers understand. Which is not to say that I'm saying the science is always right. Science can also make mistakes, and it can also be corrupt. That's true. But you have to be very careful about talking about a complex science like vaccine research from a completely inexperienced point of view. Remember, we talked about at the beginning, just a complete lack of experience. How many vaccines have you designed? How much immune system science have you done? And yet you're so confident about your views on vaccines. See, this is the problem. Another very important aspect of low perspectives is information warfare. Low perspectives weaponize information to advance a personal or collective survival agenda. They manipulate information and knowledge. And they eagerly engage in propaganda, and they don't see a problem with this. They don't see what's wrong with propaganda. In their eyes, propaganda is good because it's spreading the message. It's spreading the truth, right? If you have the truth, why not propagandize it on every channel? They don't understand the problem with that. But you see, higher perspective understands when you actually go through the process of acquiring real truth, when you go through inquiry, you realize truth cannot be disseminated through belief systems or ideology or propaganda. Truth can only be arrived at through a genuine process of inquiry, which is antithetical to propaganda. But if you don't care about truth from the very beginning, and you don't care about epistemology, then none of this matters to you. Lower perspectives also misplace loyalty in political activism. They prefer to win at political activism versus something more abstract and philosophical like sense-making or pure understanding or epistemics or truth-seeking. Right? See, Fox News people don't care about sense-making or accuracy or epistemology. What they care about is political activism. They care about their tribe winning, their team winning. And so one way you can tell very easily lower quality perspectives is that they're politically radicalized and they're partisan. Higher minds are nonpartisan and they're not politically radicalized because they understand that the issue is much more complex. There's not a clear right and wrong side. Each side makes mistakes and has flaws in it, but also hits upon some truths that they need to be balanced out and not just demonized or defeated. A lower mind doesn't understand that. It just wants its team to win. It thinks that that's what life is about, just your team winning, crushing the opposition through power and strength and truth, but the truth there is not real truth, it's just posturing and fantasy and selfishness masquerading as truth. Lower perspectives are concerned about optics and winning versus the truth. Think about Trump. Does Trump care about the truth? No, he cares about just the optics and winning. Lower perspectives are engaged in proselytizing and evangelism. Higher perspectives are not. Higher perspectives respect other minds and other points of view enough not to try to dominate them. See, domination is not just in terms of beating someone over the head with a club. Domination is also about trying to impose your worldview on them. Rather than, a higher mind will give space, will not want to propagandize children, will give children space to grow up and to go through an inquiry process and explore different religions and different perspectives and then come to its own conclusions. Whereas somebody who's addicted to an ideology wants their children indoctrinated into their ideology and wants the whole world inducted into their ideology. That's what a lot of Wahhabist Islam is like. That's why that's low. Lower perspectives do not distinguish between indoctrination and education or facilitation. So there's a difference there. To indoctrinate is just to memorize stuff. Proper education and facilitation is when you help someone to do an exploration. Not to have them believe something that you want them to believe, but to genuinely explore. For example, you can facilitate a child into exploring mathematics. That means you don't teach him the multiplication table. You don't teach him to memorize anything. You don't teach him formulas or little shortcuts for how to do math equations. You just help him to explore. You get a couple of objects and you add them together and you see and you let the child discover what is addition. Just by moving some objects around on a board, you can get a child to understand what is addition, what is subtraction, what is division, what is multiplication. That's a facilitation. Rather than just telling your child to here, memorize this multiplication table, this is what's true. That's the difference. There's a difference between indoctrinating someone into believing in God versus having someone realize what God is. Huge difference. Lower perspectives are unconcerned about conflicts of interest. They often have a lot of conflicts of interest and they don't mind. For example, Trump has many conflicts of interest. He owns businesses and this sort of stuff, and he doesn't divest from any of them when he becomes president. Does he care? No. Do his supporters care? No. Why not? Because they don't care about conflicts of interest. Because they're not developed enough to understand the problems that come with that. Conflicts of interest distort your understanding of reality. Also, they corrupt politics. Lower perspectives are unsustainable, unscalable, and they don't care that they're that way. Burning fossil fuels is unsustainable, but people in lower perspective don't care that it's unsustainable because they don't think that far ahead. Low perspectives think very short term. And also, low perspectives have low environmental awareness. Why is that? Because they're too self-centered. Notice something, that animals, we like to think of animals as these beautiful creatures who wouldn't pollute the earth, but animals don't care about their environment. They don't. Why not? Because they're not conscious enough to care. Do beavers care about the impact they have on the environment around them? No. Now you might say, well, Leo, beavers have a positive impact because they build little ponds, they block streams, build little ponds. That's good for the fish and so forth. Some of that is true, but beavers can also do damage. If beavers are doing damage to the environment, do they care? Of course not. They're not conscious enough to care. They don't understand what they're doing. They're just doing their beaver thing. They're doing what's good for the beavers. What's good for the beavers is to build a pond and then build their nest in the pond and then raise their kids, and that's all beavers care about. Well, humans act the same way a lot of times about the environment. It takes a lot of consciousness to start to care about the environment because you have to start to see how your actions and your tribe's actions have negative consequences and externalities on the environment. You have to care about how your corporation, which pays your paycheck, is negatively influencing and your paycheck is coming from the externalities that the corporation is offloading onto the public, right? To become conscious of all this takes a lot of responsibility and ethics and integrity. It's much easier not to care about that. Also, lower perspectives live in and create media echo chambers. Not only do they ensconce themselves in an ideological echo chamber, like I said before, you can go into the right-wing echo chamber of Fox News, Ben Shapiro, Jordan Peterson, all that stuff. But then it also perpetuates that echo chamber, right? You then become a podcaster who then adds to the dynamic. Whereas higher perspectives tend to want to undo echo chambers. They're careful not to find themselves in an echo chamber or to create an echo chamber, right? Like, for example, I put a lot of time into thinking about how to not make actualize.org an echo chamber. Lower perspectives lack self-reflection, very fundamentally. Lower perspectives are incapable of handling diversity because they're too finite. That's why, for example, conservatives struggle with dealing with the diversity of immigrants, races, genders, sexual orientations, artistic styles, different cultures and subcultures. Conservatives want a sort of a monoculture. They want it to be Christian. They want it to be white. They want it to be kind of like old school the way that it was. They don't want a bunch of weird punks and goths and gays and trans and postmodernists and this and that. It's too much complexity. Their mind literally can't handle this much diversity because they have a very finite, limited perspective. When your perspective is limited, you want to limit reality to that perspective. Lower perspectives do not have an understanding of non-duality. That's a rather advanced thing to have. A lot of even higher perspectives don't have an understanding of non-duality, but still, recognition of some aspects of non-duality, even if you're not enlightened or awakened or whatever, some sense of understanding of non-duality is important just for making sense of reality. Lower perspectives have no awareness of developmental stages. Spiral dynamics, or the Susan Cook-Greuter model that I've shared, the EO development model. In general, lower perspectives do not even know that developmental psychology exists, that it's a thing, that it's important, or that higher stages of development exist beyond their own. For example, your average Christian or Muslim does not understand that religion, Christianity and Islam, are fairly low stages of development, psychological development. And of course, that's very inconvenient for them to know. So it's better that they don't know that, because if they knew that, they would have an existential crisis. Lower perspectives are characterized by trying to impose its own needs, values, worldview, and agenda onto others, because fundamentally it's deeply insecure and it needs the whole world to reflect back to itself its own fantasy. So for a Christian, it's very important to go out there in the world and to evangelize. For a Mormon, they need to evangelize. Why do Mormons need to evangelize? Because fundamentally, their worldview is bullshit. So now you have to do work to keep the water from sinking your boat. So they work on that every single day of their lives. That's what they're committed to. Lower perspectives believe that everyone should live by my values and by my morality, right? Everyone should be a Christian. Everyone needs to be a Muslim. Everyone needs to be a Mormon, because the Mormons have the best values. The best morality is the Mormon morality. Or no, it's the Jewish one. A Zionist believes that everyone should be a Jew. Well, that's actually sort of wrong. I kind of overspoke. It's actually interesting that Jews are one of the few religions that don't really practice evangelism. Very interesting. And in that respect, I actually respect Judaism a lot in that respect. because they have sort of a taboo against proselytizing, which is actually, that actually puts them higher amongst other religions in that respect. A religion that proselytizes and imposes and dominates other people's minds with its religion, that's a lower religion than one that doesn't do that. So the lower perspective tends to believe that there's only one right way to live and to view reality, their way. If you don't view reality my way, then you're just wrong and you're evil and you're going to hell. It's as simple as that. How simple is that? That's a simple way to live. It absolves you of taking any kind of intellectual responsibility for making sense of other people's worldviews, if that's your worldview. And lastly, lower quality perspectives tend to come from mental illness and mentally unhinged or mentally disturbed minds. Now, I'm not saying that all mental illness leads to lower perspectives, but there does tend to be a pretty high correlation between these two. I've noticed this. And it just makes sense as well, right? If you're mentally ill, if you have some sort of mental disorder, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, BPD, multiple personality disorder, then you're going to have a much, much harder time making sense of reality, being emotionally and mentally stable. You're going to be tormented. You might hear voices from demons in your head. It's going to be really hard for you to develop a solid understanding of reality from that point of view, because you're going to be so emotionally disturbed and psychologically disturbed that you're really not going to be able to you're going to struggle to just survive in life. Never mind to go through the sophisticated and subtle epistemics and fact-checking your own mind against self-deception. Very, very unlikely. So people with mental illness generally end up becoming very self-deceived people, which is not to stigmatize mental illness, because there's also some interesting truths within mental illness. Some, interesting states of consciousness that you can actually use as a form of spirituality. So I'm not demonizing them, but generally speaking, mental illness will come with low quality sense-making, low quality epistemics, and lower perspectives. All right, so that's the list of all the criteria that I came up with for lower perspectives. Now, there's another list for higher perspectives, which we need to get into, but we spent so much time just on this that I'm already exhausted, and it's too long for a single episode. So we're going to start to wrap it up right here. But just a few concluding remarks about this list that I gave you. Contemplate this whole list. See if you can come up with even more. If you do, please tell me. I'd like to hear. Post down in the comments section. Post on my forum. Let me know. I'm genuinely interested in anything that I missed here in terms of criteria for distinguishing lower perspectives. So please do that. Also, contemplate the validity of these. Maybe some of these things aren't valid in your mind. Think about that. Think about the causal connections. Why is each of these points true? Don't just take it as true. Now, as you can see, this is a lot of stuff. I mean, this is like a decade or more of work for you to do. How do you avoid all that stuff? It requires so much development work. See, now you see what Actualize.org is really about. It's all about avoiding this. It's developing yourself out of that lower kind of perspective. So you might also ask, like, Leo, what about you? I mean, it seems like sometimes you don't clear the bar in terms of all these points. I've seen you be judgmental, and I've seen you be moralistic, and I've seen you commit some of these, sometimes you're angry and emotional, whatever. Sometimes you straw man this position or that position. So I see you sometimes making these mistakes. Well, let me say a few points about that. First of all, of course I make mistakes. And of course I don't perfectly avoid all these issues because this is so difficult to avoid. There's so much stuff here. You'd have to be like God levels of conscious and developed to avoid all this stuff. So yeah, sometimes I fall into this. Also, what you see throughout the last 12 years of my work, you see a sort of an evolution of myself, my mind. And so the further back you go into my work, the more you're going to see these errors. And I've corrected a lot of them over the last 12 years, and I will continue to do that. A lot of the corrections I've made just in the last 2 years where I haven't been publishing very many videos. So a lot of the videos, keep in mind, is 2 years older and older. My new understanding of reality and myself and self-deception and all these mechanics is so profound now, so much better and deeper and more mature than it was even 2 years ago. And I haven't even released that much work based on this new understanding and maturity that I've built up over the last few years. So there's that. But look, I mean, avoiding all this stuff is really, really, it's a gargantuan task to develop yourself to these kinds of levels out of all this garbage. Also, I want to point out to you that there are many degrees of lower perspectives. So not only am I going to help you to distinguish between the lower and the higher, but also you got to distinguish between many different kinds of Christianity, of Islam, qualities of science. There's lower science, higher science, lower Buddhism, higher Buddhism. So, yeah, that's an interesting exercise. If you want, try to rank these different ideologies and perspectives that are out there, some of which I've talked about here. Make a list of them and then try to rank them in terms of, what are the lower, what are the higher, and more importantly, like, what are the different degrees of low and the different degrees of high? In general, the big picture of what's going on here is that your mind is tricking you all the time. And if you make a deep study of these tricks and you study these tricks for years and for decades, you will come up with a list of all the tricks, which is what I did. I've shared this list with you many times in the past. I have a whole multi-part series called Self-Deception, Part 1, Part 2, Part 3, where I explain many of these mental tricks. But here we're kind of taking a different angle at it, making a different kind of list of these various kinds of tricks. You can think of each of the points in this list as a kind of a mind trick that your mind will play on you and deceive you in this way. And it takes a lot of experience within your own mind and self-reflecting to be able to identify all these tricks and overcome them. So the reason that all of these different criteria mentioned here are low is ultimately because they are survival mechanisms of the self. And that's what we're dealing with, is we're dealing with different qualities of self, lower self, higher self, and everything in between. Survival corrupts your mind. Almost nobody is conscious of all of these tricks because they're so busy surviving. They're under so much survival pressure from their environment, from their social group, their family obligations, just feeding their children, and all this kind of stuff that you got to do just to survive, that it leaves very little mental resources and time and energy for doing the epistemic work. It's much easier just to ignore it and just to go about surviving in life. But if you do that, then you're going to be stuck at a certain low level of development, right? Nobody is born with high development. Nobody is born knowing all of these tricks of the mind. You only learn this through deep experience, years and decades of experience. It took me 40 years of experience to learn all this stuff, such that I can speak about it now with such, fluency. And still, it's just because I can speak about it doesn't mean that I'm totally free of all the traps. And so the more your mind tricks you into acting selfishly for pure survival, the more of these traps and tricks you fall into, the lower your perspective is. That's what's really going on. Okay, we're going to wrap it up here. In the next part, we're going to be talking about qualities and features and criteria for the higher perspective. We're going to talk about that. And then we have even more to talk about beyond that. There's so much material here that we're going to have a part 2 and even a part 3 to this whole series. And we're working towards something very deep here. We're working towards an understanding of not just the high perspectives, but ultimately towards, in part 3, I'm going to talk about perspectives that go not just rational, post-rational, but beyond the post-rational. Like, what are the highest levels of human cognitive development look like? How do you get there? What distinguishes it from everything else? This is very rare stuff. Extremely few human beings know that these levels of development exist, and they don't explain them very clearly, as I will do here for you. So make sure that you stick around for that.